Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Joe O'Brien. We've got special coverage over the coming hours of the arrival of Julian Assange back in Australia. We're expecting his plane is going to touch down in Canberra at the Fairburn Defence Base there in around 30 minutes. We understand the media is being kept at a bit of a distance there, so we're not expecting any comments there, but we'll see. WikiLeaks has said there'll be a media conference at 9:15 Eastern Time. It's being described as a WikiLeaks media conference with no mention of who is actually going to speak there. So at this stage, it's not clear if we're actually going to hear from Julian Assange tonight. But here on the news channel, we're going to be across that arrival and the media conference, and we'll have commentary from a friend of Julian Assange's and other experts over the coming hours. So a 14-year saga comes to an end tonight for Julian Assange. The WikiLeaks founder is due to touch down on home soil and into the arms of his family after pleading guilty to one count of espionage. The standoff with the United States now brought to a close in an obscure territory of the US. North Asia correspondent James Oaten reports from the Pacific island of Saipan.
After a battle spanning more than a decade,
how does it feel to be a free man, Mr. Assange?
Julian Assange's legal odyssey is finally over. The WikiLeaks founder walking free, heading home to Australian soil.
Today is a historic day. It brings to an end 14 years of legal battles. And finally, after 14 years of legal battles, Julian Assange can go home a free man.
The 52-year-old faced court on the island of Saipan. It's the closest US territory to Australia and a compromise due to fears about stepping foot on the US mainland.
Julian, how are you feeling?
Supported by US Ambassador Kevin Rudd and Australia's High Commissioner to the UK, Stephen Smith. Mr Assange pleaded guilty to conspiring with former US Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning to obtain and disseminate classified documents, hundreds of thousands of files that would be posted on WikiLeaks. That single charge carrying a maximum of 10 years in jail, instead a federal court judge determining time already served was enough punishment.
He pleaded guilty to an offence for having published information in the public interest, for which he's won journalism awards the world over and been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize every year for the past decade.
Julian Assange may have walked from this courthouse a free man, but the judge warned him this plea deal was only possible due to the passage of time. It's clear now, she explained, that no one was harmed as a result of his actions, and having already spent 5 years in one of Britain's harshest jails, there was no need to detain him any longer. His supporters say the charges were a warning.
This is about more than Julian Assange. This is about freedom of the press. This is about how we treat journalists in this country and around the world.
We don't want this to happen to anybody else, because that would really have a chilling effect on investigative journalism.
Lawyers for Julian Assange say he plans to continue his work with WikiLeaks, but in the days ahead, friends and family say recovery is a priority.
I think he probably is looking forward to time with his wife and his two small children. I think probably most of the memories his two small children have of him are of daddy behind bars.
Returning home to a family ever grateful for Australia's support.
We, Australians, managed to turn around a superpower in its attempt to destroy an Australian citizen.
A free man, but also now a felon. James Oaten, ABC News, Saipan.
And the Albanese government has welcomed Julian Assange's return to Australia, closing a chapter on a torrid legal battle which has dragged on for more than a decade. Despite mixed views on his guilt or innocence, there's broad consensus in the federal parliament that the WikiLeaks founder and his family have suffered enough. From Canberra, here's political reporter Matthew Doran.
Welcoming a visiting Pacific leader, but with one cautious eye on other matters developing in the neighbourhood.
Given those proceedings are happening literally in real time, it isn't appropriate to provide further commentary.
Anthony Albanese wary of saying too much while Julian Assange was on his feet in a Saipan courtroom. But once his private jet was wheels up and en route to Canberra...
This is what standing up for Australians around the world looks like.
The Prime Minister describing the release as the result of persistent diplomacy behind the scenes.
This outcome has been the product of careful, patient and determined work. Work I am very proud of.
believing he speaks on behalf of millions of Australians.
Regardless of your views about his activities, and they will be varied, Mr Assange's case has dragged on for too long.
We're very pleased to see him return to Australia, but I don't think that hero worship is an appropriate response.
Julian Assange means a different thing to just about every person.
The WikiLeaks founder's staunchest parliamentary supporters embracing his father, while noting his release has come at a cost.
It's regrettable that Julian was left with no option but to plead guilty to one charge.
Arguing his ordeal sets a dangerous precedent.
I hope that this is the last time in a developed country, be it the United States or Australia, that the law is used to silence a journalist.
There's a reluctance within government ranks to be seen to be popping corks about Julian Assange's return. But there is a quiet sense of achievement that high-level lobbying appears to have paid off. Mr Assange's reception here in the nation's capital in coming days will give a sense of just how delicate this issue continues to be and how the government will handle sensitivities with the United States. Matthew Doran, ABC News, Canberra.
And journalist and former Al Jazeera correspondent Peter Grester, who spent 13 months in an Egyptian jail, says regardless of how people view Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder's case has serious implications for journalism.
I'm not sure that it's a good compromise. I think that everyone involved will probably be frustrated to a certain extent. Julian Assange's critics will have wanted him to serve prison. They will have wanted something much more substantial than a fairly token guilty plea to one single charge under the Espionage Act. And I'm pretty sure that Julian Assange and his lawyers will always say that he's not guilty of anything, he didn't do anything wrong. But this is the kind of deal that I think everyone, if they're not happy with, could at least live with. I think the Assange camp would have recognised that there was really no alternative, that the parties, both in the United States and I think to a certain extent the United Kingdom, had also painted themselves into a corner where there was no real option but to see some kind of guilty plea. I don't think President Biden was ever going, or the Biden administration was ever going to drop the charges entirely, particularly coming up to a very important election. And that because that would have been seen to be weak on security in some form. But equally, I don't think anyone wanted this to go to trial and for all of the messy politics surrounding it to bubble up. So yes, I think this is, as I said, something that no one was particularly happy with, but everyone could live with. I think that he's going to be feeling really quite discombobulated. There's this weird mix of joy and elation. And a certain degree of confusion and disorientation. Julian, I only spent 13 months in prison, 400 days. Julian has spent closer to 13 years. And his experience has been far more odious than anything I went through. But I also know just how strange it was to go from incarceration, which is designed to mess with your head. Fundamentally, it's a form of psychological pressure, psychological torture. And so you can't go through that experience, particularly with the degree of uncertainty that Julian has experienced in this whole ordeal, and then come out the other side and just pop straight back into normal life as if nothing had happened. It's going to be a very, very difficult transition for him, I think.
Peter Grester there, and the private jet carrying Julian Assange is due to touch down in around 15 minutes at the Fairburn Air Force Base in Canberra. National Affairs editor Melissa Clark is there. Mel, good day. So what are the final steps in Julian Assange's long journey home?
Look, it certainly has been a long journey from a high-security prison in the UK through the Northern Mariana Islands in the Western Pacific, but it will end here at RAF Base Fairburn, which is just on the other side of Canberra's commercial airport in a quieter and more discreet location. So the plane will land shortly and Julian Assange will go through an expedited process of the usual protocols, customs and biosecurity before being greeted by some of his closest family members. His family and legal team and other friends have been gathering in Canberra over the last 24 hours to greet him upon his arrival. They'll be speaking later on tonight, so will the Prime Minister. It's not entirely clear when we will hear from Julian Assange himself. Obviously, it's going to be a big transition back to normal life for him, but as someone who's been a journalist, a publisher, an entrepreneur, even a provocateur, I think we can say, we can safely assume that we will be hearing more from Julian Assange at some point.
And so, Mel, we're going to be covering this live over the next hour or so. Can you just give us an idea of where the media has been allowed to set up there? Because he's arriving at, as you mentioned, at a defence base. So are we likely to get much of a shot of him getting off the plane, for example?
Look, we should be able to see him disembarking from the plane. The RAF base, you can see behind me is the tarmac where the plane will land on the Canberra airport strip, so the same place that commercial flights in Canberra land, but instead of going to one side where the commercial airport is, we'll come to the other side where the RAF base is based and come up to this hangar behind me, which is a VIP terminal that's operated by the 34th Squadron. So when the Prime Minister leaves the country on official RAF planes, he arrives and exits from this terminal. When we have visiting heads of state coming on their own private planes, they too use this particular terminal. So we've been able to come near the side of the runway where we should be able to see Julian Assange disembark from the plane. Whether we'll be able to see him meet his family is another question, but I guess we'll know in about 15 minutes' time.
Yeah, and extremely unlikely that we're actually going to hear anything from him there.
That's right. We can't actually access directly the tarmac or anyone involved in the process at this stage here. This is very much a airfield side viewing point as opposed to any direct contact to him, but with his family and supporters speaking later on today. And as I said, I'm sure we'll hear from Julian Assange himself at some point. I think his court appearance today in the Northern Mariana Islands made it clear that he still has very strong views about this political process that has been tied up with the legal process that he's been through. So at some point we'll hear from him, but it won't be by the side of the airport.
Indeed. OK, Melissa Clark there in Canberra. And political reporter Matthew Doran joins us now from another part of Canberra. So this is the East Hotel in Canberra. We're expecting what's being described as a WikiLeaks media conference later this evening. Matt, g'day. So what can you tell us about this media conference? Do we know who's actually speaking at this?
Joe, good evening to you. We don't actually know who will be speaking at this press conference. They are setting up a room just off from the lobby here at the East Hotel, not far from Canberra Airport, setting up for this press conference. But details are still pretty sketchy as to whether or not we will hear from Julian Assange here tonight, members of his family, whether or not they will appear as well. What we do know is that a short time ago, Stella Assange and John Shipton, Julian Assange's father, left this hotel en route to the Canberra airport to be reunited with Julian Assange when that plane lands in the next 20 minutes or so. It's quite interesting down here just because there is certainly a vibe that this is pretty haphazard, that not a lot of people were expecting this to be happening here at the East Hotel. For people who know Canberra, the very famous Kingston Hotel is just across the road. Fair few people lining up there to watch the State of Origin match and wondering why there is such a media presence over the road. Couple of restaurants here, people looking through the windows wondering what on earth is going on, and there is a bit of a police presence here as well, considering what we're about to start seeing in the next couple of hours or so. So details pretty scant at the moment, Joe, but if we do hear from anyone from the WikiLeaks campaign, it looks like it will be here sometime after 9 o'clock.
So Julian Assange's plane is due to touch down at Fairburn Air Base in Canberra within the next few minutes. He's landing at this defence airbase and it doesn't look like there's going to be anything said at that point. The media is being kept a bit of a distance away. WikiLeaks says there'll be a media conference at 9:15 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. It's not clear even if Julian Assange will speak at that media conference. It's described as a WikiLeaks media conference, but we'll be across it all for you here on the news channel. In the meantime, with the arrival imminent, we've got a panel of people to talk to because this is a big moment after more than a decade of an extraordinary saga. We've got US politics expert from the University of Sydney, Simon Jackman, here in the studio with me, and political lead David Spears in Canberra. And a little later, we're expected to have Julian Assange's friend Sulet Dreyfus and also his brother, Gabriel Shipton, to talk to. Simon Jackman, we'll start with you. Just how and we'll keep an eye on the pictures because that plane is due to touch down at any moment. Just how significant a moment is this in terms of the Australia-US relationship?
Look, I think principals on both sides will be pleased to see this one in the rearview mirror. I think once Albanese took it on as an issue, he is therefore then obliged to bring it up every time he meets Joe Biden, every time minister-to-minister contact is happening. I think both sides are happy that this one is now in the rearview mirror and they can start talking about other things, number one. But I'd also chalk it up, it's an impressive performance by Ambassador Rudd and by High Commissioner Stephen Smith. And I think this speaks to sort of a truism of Australian politics. We put very high-placed people into those roles, and today I think is an example of precisely why we are bringing people, a former Prime Minister and a former Foreign Minister, respectively, have used their experience and their political capital to deliver, I think, what right across the Australian political spectrum is considered a good day for Australian diplomacy. Just how much of a thorn in the side of the relationship had it been? Look, I don't think a big one, to be honest. I think we had to wait for this moment where we had an Australian Prime Minister that had publicly committed to progressing this issue and I think met a friendly voice in having a Democratic administration in the United States. But I think, make no mistake, if you read the press release by the US Department of Justice today, they are not taking any backward steps in regarding their view of Assange's culpability. The fact they still wanted a guilty plea, that he hasn't been let off. It is for time served that he's been let go. So I don't think the US, I think I'd be interested to hear what went on behind the scenes, but there are no backward steps if you read that statement very closely from a Joe Biden Department of Justice. They are making no qualms about their view of what Julian Assange did. Now, Julian Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, has actually just joined us. Gabriel, g'day, and thanks so much for joining us on what must be a huge moment for you right now with this plane due to touch down. Have you been keeping an eye on the flight tracker, and how are you feeling about this moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty surreal to imagine Julian flying across Australia in that tiny little plane. But yeah, keeping an eye on the flight tracker. We're nearly there, I think, right? Probably 20 minutes out or something like that. No, it's like 1 or 2 minutes away. Oh, there we go. Yeah, pretty exciting moment. We've been working on this, for so long, and to finally, being a few minutes away, it's just. Yeah, hard to describe. Hard to describe the emotion that I'm going through at the moment. I can't imagine my dad and Stella. They're going to meet Julian on the tarmac. I just spoke to my dad as well. He was just going through the gates to the airport. So, yeah, they're a pretty special moment for our family. Were there times when you think this moment wouldn't come and Julian would actually end up in the US behind bars for a very long period of time? Yeah, that was our greatest fear, that Julian would be extradited to the United States and lost to us forever. But I had faith. That the more people we spoke to, the more advocacy work we did, the more people that came to see what was at stake in this case and began advocating and supporting us in our work. So, we were seeing that change slowly, but steadily. We were seeing that change in our relationships, in all the work that we were doing in the advocacy for Julian. So that gave us a lot of faith to keep pushing forward and continue on with this campaign that's come to a head now. And there are just so many people out there who have been involved and made a contribution to this, including the government, but many Australian people out there who are probably watching now, who have supported our campaign. I just want to thank them all from the bottom of our hearts. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. Yeah, that seems to be the comment coming up from family over and over and over, is that this has really been a grassroots effort. And have you been surprised at the breadth of support you've got from around the world? It's pretty incredible, the support and how this issue brings people together. And I'm always amazed how we've been able time and time again in this campaign to bring people from both sides of politics, or people who don't necessarily agree on many issues, but they could come together for Julian and for those principles that are at stake, the press freedom principles, the freedom of expression principles, and Julian's basic human rights, his right to justice, his right to a fair trial. Those issues really connect with people and bring them together no matter where they are on the political spectrum, old, young. They're issues that matter to people out there, and it's incredible that it's brought them together. But I think just on the deal that Julian had to plead guilty today to essentially doing journalism, to publishing truthful information, and with the response that we've seen out of some of our supporters in the US Congress, particularly on the Democratic side, is that, of course, this is a good day for Julian. He has secured his freedom, but this is a bad day for press freedoms around the world, particularly in the United States. Representative McGovern had tweeted that out, that this is a dangerous precedent that everyone should be worried about. And also Jamil Jaffer from the Knight First Amendment Institute in the United States has also called it out as a very dangerous precedent that has been set, that Julian has had to plead guilty and essentially serve 5 years imprisonment for publishing truthful information. And so off the back of that, we're going to pursue a pardon now. We're going to request a pardon from the Biden administration. This is out of the courts now. It's out of the hands of the DOJ, and it really is teed up for Biden to make a magnanimous gesture to the press freedom community, to the Progressive Caucus, who have been advocating for Julian in the Congress for many years. It's a real moment that he could step up and take some of that goodwill up and do something for press freedom.
How confident are you of that actually happening ahead of an election? And especially considering the Department, Simon Jackman on our panel just referred to a Department of Justice statement that came out earlier today in the wake of this, adamant that Julian Assange still did the wrong thing, referring to, and I'm quoting from that document, saying there was the release of raw classified documents without removing any personally identifying information, and distinguishing your brother from the legacy media organisations on that point, taking that into account, and that is the departmental approach to this still. Are you confident that Joe Biden would agree to something like a pardon?
Well, I think, as I just outlined, there is a large constituency in the United States that sees this deal that Julian's had to plead guilty to secure his freedom as a threat to their system of democracy. And there is a large amount of goodwill out there. I know the security establishment, the intelligence community, James Clapper even came out to say that they were satisfied with this prosecution, that they were satisfied with the amount of time that Julian served. And I think that that deal really speaks to them, really speaks to that community. And I want to give credit to the Australian government, of course, for performing that miracle, actually securing Julian's freedom while satisfying the Department of Justice in their pursuit of Julian for publishing this information. I think the government and the diplomats have really pulled off something pretty close to a miracle by getting Julian home, not going through the United States and going through that other jurisdiction, the Mariana Islands, and getting him back to Canberra. So credit where credit's due there, but there is a large constituency who have been against this prosecution from the outset. The New York Times even wrote to President Biden calling on him to drop this, so because of the threat that it poses to press freedom. So I think it's something that President Biden could do, and it would send a clear signal that his administration is standing for press freedom. It's agreeing with the New York Times. It's agreeing with the Progressive Caucus, with Congressman McGovern and other senators, that this is a threat to their democratic system, their First Amendment, and press freedom all over the world.
And Gabriel, I'm just interested to hear from you if there was any sense of particular urgency with this before a possible Trump administration later this year. Was that playing into the minds of the Assange camp?
It certainly was. We don't know what's going to happen in November, and you know, we don't really know what's going to happen in an incoming Trump administration either. President Biden had said that he was considering even dropping the charges when he was asked about this a couple of months ago, and so that was a real signal to us that the president, this was on the president's radar, and that there needed to be a real push now to get this done before any election season, either in the UK as well, but also in the United States. There was also a hearing coming up in the UK. Julian had been given a full appeal hearing, and it was on these freedom of expression grounds, these very important grounds that if Julian was extradited, that he would not have freedom of expression rights that he enjoyed in the United Kingdom, and that he would be discriminated against because of his nationality. Because he was an Australian, the prosecutors would argue that he is not entitled to First Amendment protection. And so the courts in the UK were about to have a hearing on that as well, which I don't think the DOJ was very eager to participate in. But I think the biggest factor was the intense advocacy from the Australian government, the resolution that went through the Australian Parliament in February. That overwhelming support from the Australian public and the Australian Parliament, I think, has really made the difference in this case.
Okay, Gabriel, I can report to you that just as you've been speaking, your brother has touched down back in Australia. How does that feel?
Yeah, awesome. That's so good. That is so good. Look at that plane. That is so awesome. Oh God, can you see him in the window? Wow.
It's a little hard to make out. What do you think of the team of people who've been with him over the last 24, 48 hours?
Well, some of them, Jennifer Lawrence, one of his lawyers, she's been around for many, many years in this fight. So yeah, we've worked closely together with both Barry Pollock and Jennifer Robinson. I've met with the Ambassador Rudd on my trips to Washington many times, as well as Stephen Smith. So yeah, we're very appreciative of the support of those expert diplomats, as well as those expert legal minds who are able to hash out this deal. But I think, very, very thankful to everybody who's been involved in this. There's people who protest every week on the street corner out at Town Hall or down at in Melbourne, all the way to these people who are at the coalface at the very end. It is just an amazing thing to be a part of, and so thankful.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we've got special coverage of Julian Assange's return to Australia. His plane has just touched down at the Fairburn Air Force Base in Canberra after a journey from Saipan, this curious little island in the Western Pacific, which is a US territory, which he wanted his case heard. He did not want to go to the continental US. He wanted that to be heard in Saipan. He pleaded guilty to a single charge in relation to espionage, and the judge sentenced him to time already served. and he has just touched down back in Australia. We've just been chatting to his brother, Gabriel Shipton, as the plane touched down. And we've also got Soulette Dreyfus with us now, who has been a long-time friend of Julian Assange's and wrote a book with him, in fact, back before I think it was before 2000 even. Soulette Dreyfus, how are you feeling seeing these images?
Oh, absolutely elated. This has been a long time coming, and I am thrilled to see him landing on Australian soil.
Is there a time when you think this might not happen?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of times, Julian has wound his way through the court system in the UK, and it's been a bumpy ride. There have been a lot of knockbacks, and every time there was a knockback, we sort of had our heads in our hands collectively and just going, oh no, this is not going to happen. We're never going to get him home. And so this is just a joyous moment. And I think in many ways, the last decision that the courts made, which gave him leave to appeal on certain grounds, really gave us a buoyancy of hope that maybe it would cause things to move forward, and hopefully it has. This is what, the outcome might be from it.
And what do you think this is? We're just about to see Julian get off this plane. What do you think this moment signifies, Soulette Dreyfus?
Well, I think what's important about this moment, there are a couple of different things. One of the important things is that, we've seen an independent publisher and journalist stand up to, the might of the U.S., really the U.S. military and intelligence agencies, to argue, to fight his corner for being able to do the job of a journalist, which is to hold power to account. It's to make sure that what you report is accurate, but that you are fearless in your reporting. And if that causes embarrassment to politicians or government departments, then so be it. In the public interest, the public has a right to know, and they need that information to make informed choices at the voting booths. I mean, that's how an open democracy works, right? So I think this is a great success story for that. I think, to be honest, the Biden White House has done a very smart thing in bringing this to an end, and they have worked very closely with the Prime Minister of Australia. That has been a terrific outcome, because here Julian is, and I don't know with another administration sitting in that chair that would have happened. So it's a very significant moment, and it's a significant moment for freedom of the press and freedom of expression.
And there's speculation about what he'll do now, and based on what he said in court and his bit of a defiant statement there in the court, he'll obviously continue to say what he thinks. But on a personal level, this will be really important for him just to reconnect and connect with family and take care of his mental health.
Yeah, I mean, I think Julian probably may want to have some time with his family, and he might want to do it in a quiet place. I mean, you don't come out of 5 years in the, scariest maximum security prison in the UK where people who are terrorists, who blow things up are sentenced to spend time without some need of healing time. And I think that's probably what he'll be looking forward to with his family. It'll be wonderful for his wife and children to get to see him, to have memories of Daddy when he's not in a prison. That will be a very important, significant, and positive change. And so I think that will be a well-deserved break for him. And being home, that just makes it wonderful.
Do you really want to be at the base of those stairs right now?
I do want to be at the base of those stairs. I know he's got probably a big couple of days ahead of him, and there are many thank yous for so many people, especially in Canberra, who put a lot of effort into bringing him home. Many of the politicians who come from such different political ends of the spectrum. To me, it was quite kind of life-affirming about our political system, where we so often see our politicians throwing grenades at each other at question time, in the parliament, and not always behaving in exactly the way we would like. But the idea that this cause of freedom of expression and freedom of speech and freedom of the press would draw together politicians from opposite ends of the spectrum, independents, crossbenchers, Andrew Wilkie, George Christensen. You find people, Barnaby Joyce, people who you didn't expect to step forward and say something, and they have. And they've done it from all sides of politics, and they've gone hand in hand to Washington as well, which I think was very important. The idea that you have, a former prime minister, that you have Kevin Rudd, advocating for him. I kind of have a bit of a joke with other people who've been involved in trying to campaign for him over time. The two white-haired guys from Queensland have had a chance now to share their big ideas on the plane ride from Northern Mariana Courthouse to here. And that, I think, is probably a great thing. I'm sure that Julian very much enjoys Kevin Rudd's intellectual thinking and big picture. So it is fantastic to see. And I think it's a really joyous moment for Australia as well, because Australia made an ask of its big brother, its ally. And I don't often think that Australia makes those kind of big asks. And, I guess maybe there hasn't been the confidence to say, hey, this is really important. This is our citizen. We want him home. And the U.S. listened. The Biden White House listened more particularly. And that's a good thing.
And if you're just joining us, you were listening to Soulette Dreyfus there, who was a co-author and longtime friend of Julian Assange. This is a live shot from the Fairburn Air Force Base in Canberra, where Julian Assange's plane has just touched down after a journey from Saipan in the Western Pacific, where he pleaded guilty to a single charge, and is finally back in Australia after an extraordinary saga spanning more than 14 years. And David Spears, Soulette Dreyfus was there talking about how politicians have united across the board in support of Julian Assange. To what extent has that happened in Australia?
Well, it's been right across quite the spectrum, as mentioned there, from Barnaby Joyce on one end to Andrew Wilkie on the other. But while there has been this quite extraordinary consensus, and you don't see this much at all in Australian politics these days, consensus that enough's enough, he be brought home, there are still very different views, it is worth noting here tonight, as to what Julian Assange did, whether it was right or wrong, and worth noting that while the Prime Minister clearly has played a big role in achieving this historic moment, he has never defended Julian Assange's actions or weighed into these issues around press freedom and the US Espionage Act and this balance between First Amendment protections and national security and so on. And you can understand why. A, he doesn't want to tread too much on the toes of the US when he's trying to secure the return of an Australian. But B, there might be some hypocrisy given we don't have great whistleblower protections or press freedom protections in Australian law either. But look, this is a moment that we're about to witness of Julian Assange, a free man, about to step foot on home soil for the first time in 14 years. That clearly is one that Australians will celebrate, because Anthony Albanese came to the position earlier than many others in this building where I am, but then Peter Dutton last year as well, and this was critical too, that given all he'd gone through, this extraordinary ordeal, clearly the judgment was the punishment outweighed any crime here, and Australia making that so clear to the United States, to President Biden from the top down, I think that clearly has had a big, big impact on what we're about to witness.
And I'll just mention once again that we're expecting Julian Assange to emerge from this plane at any moment. It's taken a little bit longer than we thought. It often is the case with these events. We're also expecting to hear from the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, soon as well. No doubt that he will put that off until we see these images of Julian Assange emerging from the plane, along with the other grey-haired guy from Queensland, Kevin Rudd, and O to have been a fly on the wall of that plane, listening to some of those discussions between those pair on that flight over the Pacific back to Australia. And Simon Jackman from the University of Sydney, how do you think this whole saga reflects on the US, which champions itself as a leader of freedom of the press and democracy?
It's an interesting question. I think David Spears just raised a really great point. There are limits to which Australia can jab the United States in the ribs on this one, given our own form on these issues and the fact that we do not have a First Amendment protection in Australia. So it's one thing for Australian politicians to be saying, hey, US, how about that First Amendment of yours? So I think you've got to stay away, I think, from that argument. It's not altogether a helpful one. That said, I think, yes, I'd point to, you mentioned it before, Joe, this distinction between the way legacy media would handle a document drop like this, and I'd refer to the Snowden case, where that was dealt with altogether differently from this rather more free-for-all, more cavalier sort of WikiLeaks approach. And I'd say no one, there haven't been prosecutions on the back of the Snowden case, at least none that have been pursued with the vigour that they've gone after Assange. And I think that's an important distinction to draw, that yes, in the United States you have a First Amendment right, but there's also perhaps the national security equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theatre. You do not have a First Amendment right to yell fire in a crowded theatre. And again, I come back to that Justice Department document that points to the fact that the unredacted information named people that were actively helping the US State Department in the cause of promoting human rights and freedom. Some of the people that I think many people on the pro-Assange side would identify as their natural allies were put at some risk, some material risk on the wake of, as I said, sort of the more cavalier approach that the WikiLeaks people took back in the day. And I think that whole world has moved on somewhat. I think the way these document drops are dealt with today, precisely as a consequence of this, is sort of done a little bit more differently. It's not that they don't happen anymore, they certainly do, but I think it was if you will, a teachable moment for media organisations and whistleblowers alike, that there are sometimes real dangers when a trove of documents like this does come your way, and with that sort of information comes great responsibility.
It was interesting to hear the comment from the judge in the case today in Saipan, noting that there had not been any reports of anyone coming to physical harm as a result of these documents. And I can see Sulette Dreyfus nodding there. And Sulette, I might come to you in a moment because we've still got Gabrielle Shipton as well. I wasn't sure that you were still there, Gabrielle, because we've got so many people on the line now. Gabrielle, we're still waiting for your brother to come out. What's he up to?
Yeah, where is he? Come on. Well, I'm sitting here waiting, but I just wanted to mention, in the court in the Mariana Islands, the judge actually acknowledged that the US government could not find anybody who came to any harm in relation to Julian publishing these documents. So I just wanted to make that clear that even the US government has acknowledged that nobody came to any harm through the publishing of these documents, and that Julian actually devised ways to use technology to identify names in these documents and redact these sorts of names. So I just I wanted to rebut a few of those sort of, I guess, misconceptions that we were hearing earlier about Julian's actions, because he did make a real effort to redact documents, to wipe people's names off them, and the US government has acknowledged that nobody has come to any harm in relation to those publications. And in fact, what those publications showed was evidence of state criminality, war crimes, journalists being mowed down by a helicopter gunship, and then the people who came to rescue them being killed as well. So I think really focusing on what these publications revealed about how the United States wages wars, about torture in Guantanamo Bay, about how 13-year-olds were being kept at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. That's what these documents revealed. And I think it's very important that we look back at the historical record WikiLeaks in that way, rather than focusing on Julian, rather focus on what those documents showed and how he collaborated with news organisations all over the world in publishing those documents. And that's why you have the New York Times writing to President Biden, calling on him to drop these charges because of the threat they pose. I think he's about to get off the plane now.
Okay, if you're just joining us, this is Julian Assange's plane, which has touched down about 20 minutes or so ago now, I think, at the Fairbairn Defence Base in Canberra, after a flight from the island of Saipan, where he faced a court hearing this morning. That feels so long ago now, where he pleaded guilty to one charge of espionage, bringing to an end in a curious little location in the middle of the Pacific, or the Western Pacific, this saga which has dragged on for so many years. And there we see the first image.
There he is.
Raising his fist.
Yes. He's home.
There he is. Yeah, welcome home, Julie. Welcome home. There he is. Oh, wow.
And so, Gabriel, what does that raised fist indicate to you about what he's going to be getting up to over the next couple of years?
Well, I think I remember being in the court, 4 years ago in the magistrate's court, and watching from the gallery, and Julian was behind these glass panels, and he raised his fist to me when I was watching from the gallery. So, it's a message that we've shared throughout this campaign, and I think it's a signal to everybody who's been fighting this that he's going to keep fighting. So, oh wow, what a moment! Look at that.
That's fantastic.
So Julian Assange there embracing his wife and father after this extraordinary saga which has dragged on for so long. Sylette Dreyfus, his longtime friend, is with us, and who's campaigned tirelessly for him over many, many years. How are you feeling now?
Yeah, very emotional. It's quite wonderful to see. It really is. And so long time coming. I'm sure his wife is so happy. His father is so happy. And they've, of course, visited him in prison, but it's very different than seeing him stand free on Australian soil.
And we've heard earlier from Gabriel that, there's definitely going to be a push for a pardon. Sylette, what do you think the chances are of that happening?
I don't think it's impossible. I mean, the U.S. has, in a sense, been able to have its face saving with the, pleading guilty to the one charge. And it would make sense, given that Chelsea Manning received a commuting of her sentence, to pardon the publisher, who has, spent also a lengthy amount of time in prison. And also, it would send a message from President Biden's administration that they really do believe in freedom of the press, and that in the tussle between the U.S. Constitution and its amendments for press freedom and freedom of speech and the Espionage Act, yes, laws must be obeyed, but at the same time, there is this mitigating force of the Constitution, and its importance must also be recognized.
What do you make, though, of the US Department of Justice statement? I don't know if you've seen this today yet, but I can read from it, adamant that he is still guilty of the espionage, and that there was, in fact, a raw intelligence shared which put lives at risk. I know you've had a fair bit to say about this before in terms of how people view what WikiLeaks did. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of key points there. So, first of all, what Julian said in court is, yes, I released information and I obtained information, and that information was secret, but I understood that I was protected by the U.S. Constitution, and that is a reasonable position. It's one, actually, that the Supreme Court ruling from 50 years or so ago in Daniel Ellsberg's case, the Pentagon Papers said, it said to the New York Times, you can publish this, even secret information, right up to the line of publishing coordinates of a ship at sea at war. And so I think that's the first thing. The second thing is there's a constantly recycled lie, misinformation that Julian didn't redact information. And I think Gabriel has addressed it, but it's really important to note. Julian redacted tens of thousands of records, when publishing information, and no one had done this before. I mean, part of what makes Julian Assange so unique is that this was bushwhacked through a jungle with no pathway. No journalist organization had done what he did before. And so, yes, maybe there might be, some arguments, argy-bargy, is this the right way or is that the right way? But the way that he carved has absolutely been as responsible as he thought it could be at the time. And also, importantly, has, as you say, forged the way for journalistic organizations in the years since then. So it's possible that, combined with the contributions he's made to journalism, so the secure, anonymous, technologically anonymous Dropbox for whistleblowers to use to contact journalists to reveal, for example, criminal acts or corruption, the idea of journalist organizations coming together who would normally compete, but instead they work together collaboratively in the public interest to go through a giant data set. Most leaks these days might be of not just one or two documents the way they might have been before, but 2 gigabytes of documents, and that's a lot of information, and most media organizations don't have that kind of resources to go through themselves. So it's a very powerful structure that he really designed and popularized, and in light of that, I hope that the Biden administration would consider a pardon.
So we might just leave it there for a moment, just because we've come up to the top of the clock, and just repeating this break as Sulet Dravis wipes a tear from her face, I think. We are just replaying these images that have just come through from Fairburn Air Force Base in Canberra. Julian Assange, after 14 years, an extraordinary saga, has just stepped on Australian soil once again, raising his fist, and we saw him embrace his wife Stella and his father. And the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has just begun a media conference, and we might take a listen into that.
Earlier tonight, but you probably knew this, Julian Assange was reunited with his family here in Australia. His arrival home ends a long-running legal process. A plea agreement between Mr Assange and the United States Department of Justice was accepted by a US court in Saipan earlier today. I do want to express my appreciation to the United States and the United Kingdom for their efforts in making this possible. As Prime Minister, I have been very clear that regardless of what you think of his activities, Mr Assange's case had dragged on for far too long. I have clearly and consistently, at every opportunity and at every level, advocated for Mr Assange's case to be concluded. I am very pleased that this saga is over. And earlier tonight, I was pleased to speak with Mr Assange, to welcome him home, and had the opportunity to ask about his health and to have my first discussion with him. His safe return to Australia, we know, means so much to his family. His wife Stella, his children, who he is looking forward to playing with, like any dad, and his parents Christine and John. There are a range of views about the actions of Mr Assange. The Australian Government feels strongly that the proper protection of all national security information is vital for safety. But as I have said, both as Labor leader and as Prime Minister, there was nothing to be gained by the further incarceration of Mr Assange, and we wanted him brought home. Tonight, that has happened. We have got this done. I also acknowledge the efforts of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, my ministerial colleagues, Penny Wong, the Attorney General, and others. Other Australian officials who've worked tirelessly on this case, particularly over the last couple of years. In particular, I want to thank Ambassador Rudd and High Commissioner Stephen Smith, who travelled home to Australia with Mr Assange. We'll have meetings about AUKUS and other arrangements over coming days as well. They worked with his legal team to facilitate a very smooth journey. This is the culmination of careful, patient and determined advocacy, work that I am very proud of. It is yet another example of why mature, calibrated and consistent engagement with our partners is the best way to get results in Australia's national interest. Happy to take a couple of questions.
Ian, there are many views about Julian Assange, as you said. Some do not regard him as a hero. Do you think he was a journalist who was wrongfully pursued over what he did?
Oh, look, I think that there will continue to be different views about Julian Assange and his activity. My role as Prime Minister has been to firmly say that whatever the views that people have, there was no purpose to be served by this ongoing incarceration. And can I say that when I spoke with Mr Assange tonight, he described it as a surreal and happy moment, his landing here in our national capital, Canberra. He expressed his thanks to what he described as the diplomatic A-team when I spoke about the role that Kevin and Stephen have been able to play.
Prime Minister.
Do you talked about your view that this had gone on for too long. Do you think previous Prime Ministers, previous governments have been negligent to allow it to drag on so long instead of advocating as strongly as you've done?
What's important, I'm responsible for my job. My job is to advocate for Australian citizens. Chang Leia's home. Sean Turnella's home. One of the things that my government does is at times as well, we don't shout. We're not in a contest of machismo. What we do is we get things done. And my government advocated strategically, patiently, in a calibrated way, and we achieved this outcome.
Prime Minister, just a couple of quick questions. Can you confirm that you expect to meet Mr Assange in the next day or so? And secondly, could you give us a sense...
Sorry, you expect... You didn't conclude...
Will you be meeting him in the next day or so? And also, what point did you actually realise that this was going to happen? You've been working on it for a couple of years. Was it a conversation with Joe Biden? Was a message sent from State Department of Foreign Affairs? How did that play out?
Well, it played out over a long period of time. I've said that I have raised it at every opportunity at the highest level. I know that I've received a message from the US ambassador here that they are also pleased that this has been resolved. The first time I raised it was with President Biden at the NATO summit in Madrid. I raised it also with other senior members of the US administration. But this was always the case, to be very clear, that because of the separation between the political representatives and the judiciary, this was always going to be something that required discussion, patient with the Department of Justice. And certainly over that period of time, there has been an issue as well. I've exchanged very directly with Mr Assange's lawyers, as have our diplomatic representatives. And Mr Assange's lawyers have been very determined to achieve an outcome, and of course the nature of his incarceration in Belmarsh has meant that then communication had to then be got through. Stephen Smith, our High Commissioner, has visited him on a number of occasions. The details of the plea deal were worked through over a period of time. But what we have been focused on very clearly, and for some of the issues that have raised with me, it was the case that this was the only way that I could see a resolution being achieved. And the objective here was to conclude these matters. They have been concluded. They've been concluded in a way that has achieved the outcome that was sought, which is Julian Assange is now home here in Australia.
Just following up on Ms James's question, do you plan to meet with Mr Assange in coming days?
I've got Parliament tomorrow, so I'll be here tomorrow. I'm not going to assist. I'm aware of Mr Assange's movements in coming days, but I'm not about to. That's a matter for his personal privacy. Obviously, he's been through a considerable ordeal. It's up to him when he makes a statement. I was pleased to speak with him immediately upon the wheels touching the ground. I was quite pleased to be the first person here who he spoke with, which was mutually worked out that would occur. And while we're in this press conference, while some people are watching the plane and whether Mr Assange has exited the plane, other people will be focused on kick-off.
Have you spoken to the US President since there was a breakthrough, and how do you think this result will shape the US-Australia relationship going forward? They are our closest ally.
We have a very positive relationship with the United States. I regard President Biden as a friend. I regard the relationship as being absolutely central, one of the three pillars of our foreign policy here, along with our relationship in the region and our support for multilateral forums, including the United Nations. I engage. One of the things that I do, and one of the reasons why you get outcomes, is I don't come into press conferences and talk about the personal details of discussions I have.
So I was going to ask whether there was a breakthrough moment or a particular turning point in these negotiations, a moment when you realised that it would be possible.
I think there were probably a number of steps along the way, to be frank.
Can you tell us something about them?
There were moments when this required a range of decisions to be made by the Department of Justice in the United States, which of course is not subject to political influence. They're independent. If you look at the whole range of people who've been to the United States, I'm surprised that some of it was missed by the people in this room. Some of the visits, but not up to me to indicate that. Go back and have a look at some diaries and who's travelled to the United States in recent months. We wanted to be focused on an outcome, and these things don't come together till they all come together. You know, there are steps it required. A plea deal requires a two-sided agreement between the Department of Justice and Julian Assange. It requires, in this case, Mr Assange to receive advice from his legal team, and we have been in contact with his legal team over a period. He had a legal team in the UK led by his longest legal advisor, Jen Robinson, who was the conduit for direct discussions with Mr Assange, but he also had a very good legal team in the United States. Kevin Rudd worked very hard, as did Stephen Smith, as did the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as did the Attorney General, as did others as well, to achieve. Karen.
Prime Minister, the point's been made that your predecessors did not advocate for this outcome and that you have chosen to do so, and you've talked a bit about why you did that. But you've personally been very engaged since before you were even opposition leader with this. So can you tell us why you have chosen to stake so much on this, given the US relationship is so important and it must have put things under pressure at times? Why go so hard for this outcome for someone who, as you have made the point, divides the population in terms of what he did?
I believe in standing up for Australian citizens, and I make that very clear. I made it clear from the beginning. I had the same position as opposition leader on all of these issues as I've had as Prime Minister. And as Prime Minister of Australia, you have an opportunity to make a difference. I've said repeatedly across a range of areas, I'm not here to occupy the space. I'm not here necessarily to ensure that people will always be supportive by going through the details of what we are doing as we are doing them. And some people have been very critical that we weren't doing enough. What we were doing was exactly the right thing to achieve an outcome. I'm an outcomes-based politician. I believe in making a difference. We can make a difference. The United States are our friends. The United States was, of course, in a position, though, where because of the separation of powers, I believe in that as well, and have always understood that due to their system. So it wasn't as simple as me sitting down with President Biden or any other US elected representative and achieving this outcome. Diplomacy is something that must be patient, something that must be built on trust, something that works through stages. We have done that. And Mr Assange and I this evening, as I said, I've never met Mr Assange. I had a very warm discussion with him this evening, though. He was very generous in his praise of the Australian government's efforts. The Australian government stands up for Australian citizens. That's what we do. Thanks very much.
OK, so there's the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, speaking there in Canberra. Not live, but just a few minutes delay on that, speaking in the wake of these historic images, which we might play now, of Julian Assange. He looked skyward first at the top of the stairs there and raised his fist and walked down to be welcomed. And we saw him a really warm embrace with his wife Stella and eventually his dad as well. And after hearing from Anthony Albanese, I was going to go to David Spiers, and we'll get to him first, but Julian Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, I noticed, has hit the champagne. And so we might go to him first. We heard Jennifer Robinson in Saipan earlier today start first off with listing a heap of politicians who she said were instrumental in this. Listening to Anthony Albanese, then I saw you nodding on in agreement and raising your fist as well. How important has the support from politicians been?
Yeah, I don't think it would have happened without the support of the support of the government, and I wholeheartedly agree with the Prime Minister that standing up for Australians is so important, and this is a nation-building moment. I believe that getting Julian Assange back, being able to advocate with our allies and also other countries like China, who we have a relationship as well, to get people back, to get Australian citizens back, standing up for Australians. I think it strikes at the heart of what it means to be Australian. If we advocate for our citizens, it gives us all this feeling that, we're all part of something here in Australia, and our government cares about us. So I think this is an incredible moment, incredible move by the Prime Minister, and it could be a nation-building moment. But it was a huge effort. I went over to Washington with a delegation of politicians who met with Congress people, who met with the Department of Justice and the State Department, and that was a bipartisan delegation. We had Barnaby Joyce, Tony Zappia from the Labor Party, Andrew Wilkie, Monique Ryan, David Shoebridge, and Peter Whish-Wilson from the Greens. And that was a real impressive show of solidarity between all the major parties and the Greens and Independents to be able to come together to advocate for Julian. So there are many people who have been working away at this in the Parliament, and it's a pretty special moment. I promised my daughter, who's 10 years old, that she's wanted a dog for many years, and I said, well, when we get Julian out of prison, we can get a dog. And so she's been texting me through this whole interview with the different dogs that she wants. It's a really special moment, and I'm just overjoyed and so happy that Julian's back at home and safe. Yeah.
Your face is beaming. David Spears, it's not often we hear of politicians, or not that often that we hear of politicians talked of in such glowing terms, but we've heard it over and over from the Assange team. What do you make of what the Prime Minister said and how he's been received?
Look, a couple of things here, Joe. Just firstly to note the humanity of this moment, and having Gabrielle Shipton there, watching his live reaction as his brother stepped off that plane, the tears, then the champagne. He's going to have to get his daughter a dog. I love it. I think this is just a wonderful moment of television to see Gabrielle there. He talks about his efforts, that trip earlier this year. I remember bumping into Gabrielle towards the end of last year in Washington, just a block or so away from the White House, when Anthony Albanese was there, no doubt talking about this, raising this with Joe Biden in the White House, and he was there with others holding the placards and keeping that fight alive. So just to note that what he's talking there, it's I've witnessed it. What we heard from the Prime Minister there, look, I think we know now why it took a while to get off the plane. They were having a chat on the phone, but he spoke about Julian Assange being grateful, but also feeling surreal and very happy to be back. I mean, I think it's impossible to really know, what he must be going through, what he will be going through. But I also think it is worth noting that while the Prime Minister says and keeps repeating, this is an independent Justice Department in Australia, as Gabrielle and plenty of others point out, this wouldn't have happened without the Australian government, and I broaden that to say, really, the Australian Parliament making it very clear through the delegation Gabrielle mentions, through the motion we saw a while ago as well, this multi-party push, making it very clear that this is unambiguous where Australia stands on this. Yes, different views on what Julian Assange did, but no dispute that it's gone on too long. He needed to be brought back. The Prime Minister reflected that there tonight. Look, I think that fist in the air from Julian tonight shows defiance. It shows that his fight isn't over. What we've heard from Gabrielle and others is, they will keep fighting for that press freedom. This has been a disappointing outcome in some respects as to the precedent it sets for the way the Espionage Act has been used for those who do want greater protection for press freedom. But they'll keep fighting for that, and clearly keep fighting for a pardon as well from President Biden. But for Anthony Albanese, really, this is job done. That's what we got there tonight. This is the outcome he wanted. He's not weighing into these debates about press freedom. No indication there he's going to push for a pardon. This getting Julian Assange back was the outcome he was after, and he's very happy to take the credit for it, but that's it. That's getting the job done as far as he's concerned. For the family and supporters of Julian Assange, as I say, no doubt that push will continue to achieve those further wins.
But the PM now facing pressure from supporters of Julian Assange, with people like David McBride and Richard Boyle.
Yeah, I mean, look, as I mentioned a little earlier, this raises the issue in many ways about what protections we have for whistleblowers, for press freedom and so on. And you only have to look at last month's sentence for David McBride. more than 5.5 years in jail for leaking those military documents that did also include credible evidence of war crimes committed by Australian forces in Afghanistan, the tax office whistleblower that you mentioned there as well. So, look, you know, we still have these issues grappling with here in Australia. And perhaps one of the reasons why the Australian Prime Minister can't start belting the US over press freedoms and the reach of their own Espionage Act when we have pretty tough laws here as well.
And Simon Jackman from the University of Sydney. David Spears there mentioned the espionage law in the US and the precedent that this does set now. What is that? And is the US government likely to pursue this, go down this track again with journalists on that charge?
Look, I think it all depends on the circumstances. I think the WikiLeaks case, the Assange matter, as I said earlier, a teachable moment for how matters like this are dealt with. And legacy media, I think, has learned ways to do it differently. And we've had, the Snowden case in particular. Now, Snowden himself is in exile in Russia, but the publishers of that material, I think, behaved a little bit differently to WikiLeaks, and no government has gone after them in the way that certainly the United States government went after Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. So I think it all depends. I think also on the side of media and publishers, I think there's an understanding that when you receive material like this, an enormous burden falls on you to take that, what you do with that information. And I think if you talk to the journalists or listen to the journalists who handled the Snowden document drop, how to parse that out was an enormous sort of burden that they faced and took extraordinary steps to sort of make sure they were protecting, as they say, some of the people that are putting their lives on the line in some cases to defend democracy itself. And so you don't want to cause harm. So I think we've come down the road a long way in learning how to do this one. I think the WikiLeaks case and Julian's case is sort of was a brave new world. It's taken 14 years to get a resolution, culminating in a guilty plea, but ultimately Assange's freedom back in Australia. But I think both sides of the ledger learned a lot from that case, and I think in the United States there's still a deep, deep bedrock of presumption for press freedom, for protecting whistleblowers. And the other thing about the United States is there are lots of outlets. You can go to Congress, you can go to the media. The separation of powers itself provides lots of outlets, ways to get evidence of wrongdoing into the public debate, as it were. And again, that's sort of a little bit different to the Australian system as well. And at the end of the day, I think the First Amendment stays on the books. I think I'd probably rather be an investigative journalist in the United States than in Australia, frankly, because Australia, at the end of the day, does not have that First Amendment bedrock constitutional freedom. So a little chilling that there is a conviction now in the books of a publisher of classified information. Precedent has been set there, but I think I keep coming back to that bedrock and that ballast, if you will, in the presumption being on the side of press freedom is still very fundamental in the United States.
OK, I might just take this opportunity to go back over what's happened in the last hour or so. If you're just joining us, we've been following the arrival of Julian Assange. I think Gabrielle Shipton, his brother, might just have to leave us for the moment, unfortunately. But yeah, here we go. Julian Assange arriving back in Australia about an hour ago. He looked skyward, then walked down the stairs and raised his fist as an indication of his defiance at the trial earlier today. And then we saw him embrace his wife and father. And this is after 14 years of an extraordinary saga where he was holed up there he is embracing his wife, after he was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy for so long. I think it was 7 years. And then he was hauled out of there and ended up in a high security jail in the UK for the last 5 years or so, and there were all these efforts by the US to get him over there, and the concern was he was potentially going to be in jail. The maximum sentence was going to be 175 years or something like that. And so there was this huge effort to keep that from happening, and that effort has finally been successful, and Julian Assange has been reunited with his family, and yeah, all indicate we can see him there lifting Stella off the ground, and all the indications are that he will continue that fight for press freedom. And Sulet, we've got a panel of people we've been speaking to. Gabriel Shipton, his brother, was with us, but he started drinking champagne. I don't think he's gone. He's in Paris. He's gone off somewhere. We've got Simon Jackman from the University of Sydney with us, ABC's political lead, David Spears, and also Sulet Dreyfus, who's been a long-time friend of Julian Assange and actually wrote a book with him way back 24 years or so ago. And Sulet, I was reading a piece you did earlier today and talking about your connection with him, with Julian Assange, and that extended back to a protest against the destruction of the Fitzroy pool.
Yes,
so you go
yes.
that far back. So tell us about what he was like early on and what that indicated about what he was going to be like in the future.
Look, Julian is a person who has always carried the need for justice on his shoulder, and some people it's okay for them to walk past injustice and it doesn't really bother them. Julian's not been that person, so he finds it hard, I think, to walk past injustice when he sees it. One of the reasons he was involved in the campaign to save the famous Fitzroy pool, a pool that's historically very important. The pool's actual cement casing was designed by Sir John Monash, and it's more than 100 years old. But the pool was being closed by the local council because it, quote, didn't turn a profit. And the late comedian John Clark said, well, if that's why the pool's being closed, things aren't looking so flash for footpaths and parks, which was quite a good line. But, Julian really took up that cause. We worked on the campaign together with a set of other people, and I think it was, in some ways, an important formative action for him as someone who has been engaged in advocacy ever since. So it was really interesting, actually. This is a moment of great humanity, as David said. I would agree with that statement. And Anthony Albanese has done really quite a wonderful job here. But the thing that I found most reassuring is the fact that, the Prime Minister is not an abandoner. Anthony Albanese is a doer. He might have said he did it quietly, but he's a doer and he's going to look after Australians. Well, that's a little bit like Julian. He's a doer. He doesn't want to just let things go through the net and it doesn't matter. And I think that really matters. Maybe they do things a bit differently, but perhaps they recognize that in each other as well.
And take us back through the content of what WikiLeaks released. The most prominent, probably in the evidence that was released, or the information, were the shocking images of the Reuters journalists, among other people, being mowed down, shot in Iraq. So that's what a lot of people would remember. But what else was there among that WikiLeaks information that displayed what was going on?
Well, you have collateral murder, so that's the video of the U.S. military Apache helicopter firing on Reuters journalists and killing them, as well as just people walking down the street, and also as well as the Good Samaritan who sees people lying on the road dying and stops to try and help them, and is himself killed. So while his children are in the car watching, a terrible scene. So I remember actually when Julian was here in Melbourne in 2010, and he showed that film after it had been released by WikiLeaks to a lecture hall full of people downtown. There was a public event that he was speaking at RMIT, and a giant lecture hall. Every seat was taken, every spot on every bit of steps, the floor. He could barely walk to the podium. It was so full. And you could have heard a pin drop when this video played. People they had tears coming down their face. So it was a really shocking moment. But he went on to also do the Iraq war logs and release the Afghan war logs. And these were logs that were the everyday summary events that soldiers wrote when they were out in the field, walking around, doing rounds, patrols, in the everyday experience of a U.S. soldier in Iraq, in Afghanistan. In themselves, they perhaps weren't so, most of them were fairly mundane. They weren't so shocking per se. But in aggregate, what they showed that was really a surprise, I think, to the public and the world was that governments had promised that these wars were going very well indeed, and they were not going very well. They were going extremely badly. They were going badly because servicemen and women were being killed. They were going badly because people they were supposed to be protecting on the ground were being killed. It was just not successful. And as we know from David McBride, Australian whistleblower David McBride's revelation, there are war crimes that actually occurred in Afghanistan. So that was important. And then, of course, there were the diplomatic cables. And these cables, which were cables that were sent, we talk about cables, it's an old-fashioned technology, the idea of a cable, but it really is just a memo, like an email almost, sent of a summary event from an outpost in Bangladesh or Ecuador or wherever in the U.S., for example, back to Australia to say, this is what we've been working on, or here's an event, or something important has happened. And so it's a kind of a summary of diplomacy around the world for the U.S. Now, these cables did show some serious wrongdoing. So they showed that where the garment workers in Haiti that were earning, I think, 67 cents an hour, had wanted a pay rise, a very modest pay rise, and indeed had been supported in this by the Haitian parliament. A U.S. contractor company had, for making underwear and blue jeans, had come in and put pressure on them through the U.S. Diplomats in country to stop that pay rise. And these are some of the most poorly paid people in one of the poorest countries in the world. That was not a moment of crowning glory for the U.S. But this diplomacy has turned out to be extraordinarily important because it's in a database, and there are literally hundreds of researchers and academics around the world who have studied this to understand much better how countries run, how decisions are made, what the relationships are between them. And it's made it much more transparent, and that's, I think, quite a good thing.
And so no doubt there will be a continuing discussion about his legacy, but you think he is someone who should be celebrated and lauded?
Absolutely. I think he is a Australian success story. I think he's a groundbreaker. He's a stirrer in many ways, in the best Australian tradition of that. And that's something that we should applaud.
And when are you going to try to get a hold of him now that he's back here?
Well, I'm going to let the dust settle a little bit, and hopefully he'll have some time with his family, which is what he needs most, and then we'll catch up soon enough.
Good stuff. Okay. Now, we might just go back to the moment a little earlier in the program, just as Julian Assange was touching down. At that time, we were having a chat to his brother, Gabriel Shipton, and as I mentioned that, I can see silhouette out of the corner of my eye, wiping another tear from her face. This has been an emotional moment for many people in the Assange camp. So let's take a listen back. Yeah, we've lost Gabriel now because he started drinking champagne. But let's take a listen back now to our chat with him a little earlier. The first image.
There he is.
Raising his fist.
Yes. He's home.
There he is. Yeah, welcome home, Julian. Welcome home. There he is. Oh, wow.
And so, Gabriel, what does that raised fist indicate to you about what he's going to be getting up to over the next couple of years?
Well, I think I remember being in the court, 4 years ago in the magistrate's court and watching from the gallery, and Julian was behind these glass panels, and he raised his fist to me when I was watching from the gallery. So it's a message a message that we've shared throughout this campaign, and I think it's a signal to everybody who's been fighting this that he's going to keep fighting. So, oh wow, what a moment! Look at that.
No. That's fantastic.
So Julian Assange there embracing his wife and father. After this extraordinary saga which has dragged on for so long. Sylette Dreyfus, his longtime friend, is with us and who's campaigned tirelessly for him over many, many years. How are you feeling now? Gabrielle Shipton there, ecstatic at Julian Assange touching back down in Australia, and now he's got to buy his daughter a dog. He mentioned to us before heading off. I might go back to David Spears now. David, what do you think Julian Assange will get up to now, and possible influence on, because it's a huge name, possible influence in Australian politics?
I don't know immediately. We're told in a little over half an hour from now there's going to be some sort of statement for the press at the East Hotel in Kingston, just down the road from here in Canberra, where they're staying tonight. I'd be surprised if it's Julian Assange himself making a statement, but we'll see that soon enough. And we've, of course, got our cameras and reporters there standing by for that when it happens in just over half an hour. Look, we've been having a discussion all day here in this office and in this building around why Canberra, why not flying to Sydney or anywhere else, why Canberra? I mean, we can all speculate as to why. I suspect it does have to do with both the Ambassador and High Commissioner, Kevin Rudd, Stephen Smith, joining him on this flight. The capital, a natural place for them to come and bring him, and you can process that. I understand, in fact, the passport and visa processing, whatever, was all done on board before they disembarked the plane. Another reason why it was held up a little bit there. But I assume he's going to have some sort of discussion with either the Ambassador, High Commissioner, the Department. I don't know, do intelligence agencies get involved? The Prime Minister was a little bit cagey too as to whether he'll meet up with him, but I think it was pretty obvious that the invitation is open there. Really the ball in Julian Assange's court in regards to that. So, look, I'd expect the next day or two, I'd be surprised if he left town, but where he goes to beyond that, I don't know. In terms of his impact, in terms of Australian politics, look, I take from what he said in court, what we saw there with the raised fist, that the issues around press freedom are so important to someone like Julian Assange that this is not going to be the last we hear from him. It's impossible, as I said, for all of us to understand what processing he's going to have to go through after the experience he's been through, the ordeal he's been through. Maybe we don't see him for a while, but I wouldn't be surprised if he does weigh in globally and domestically on issues of press freedom, in particular the reach of the US Espionage Act, how laws here in Australia apply as well. I doubt this is someone that's going to be silent on these issues.
And Anthony Albanese has been so prominent on this. What do you make of the way that Peter Dutton has handled it, what he'd said before previously about Julian Assange and how he's handled it now?
Yeah, I mean, Peter Dutton really shifted his language and position, I suppose, on this last year. Anthony Albanese somewhat earlier. In fact, it was when Anthony Albanese was opposition leader that he really started using this enough is enough line. Peter Dutton, as I say, it was around May last year, so a little over 12 months ago, essentially echoed that, said he agreed that there needed to be a resolution here or a solution here, and supported whatever efforts the Prime Minister was making behind the scenes for that to happen. And I think that was quite critical in having that bipartisanship. It's really more than that when you look at the even longer work that the likes of Andrew Wilkie has done. Within the coalition, though, you had really interesting views. People like Barnaby Joyce, Alex Antic, people on the right of the Nats and the Libs, very strongly supportive of Julian Assange, very critical of what was happening to him. But you've still got, even today, people like Jane Hume, one of the senior Liberal frontbenchers, the Shadow Minister for Finance, still suggesting what Julian Assange did was reckless, dangerous, not a hero in her view, shouldn't receive a hero's welcome, were the comments she made. So you've got these quite different views within the coalition. Peter Dutton, I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why he's been pretty quiet on the issue this week. He's not said anything, as far as I'm aware, over the last 48 hours on this issue at all publicly. Certainly hasn't congratulated or celebrated the return of Julian Assange, hasn't given Anthony Albanese any pat on the back for the role the government's played here, but nor has he criticised anything. He's just stayed out of it publicly. Look, you know, is that surprising? Perhaps not. Is his comment necessary at the moment? Perhaps not. But it's perhaps telling of the somewhat mixed views within his ranks on this.
Yeah, and Sulet Dreyfus, what do you make of those ongoing comments from some people, including politicians, that what WikiLeaks did and Julian Assange did was reckless?
Yeah, I think either they don't know the full facts and perhaps they have swallowed some of the misinformation that has circulated, so much misinformation over the years, really, it's shocking. Or perhaps they're just out of touch with how most Australians feel on this issue. You know, success has many parents, and success in this case has thousands of parents, so many volunteers from around Australia who made art, street art, and, you know, held public events and town hall debates and wrote op-eds and really did everything, public rallies. And that groundswell that groundswell came because people up and down the coast, across the country, really developed a view about bringing Julian home from understanding of the situation. So I hope that they can be convinced with better information to open their minds to why this is important so that they're better aligned with the public views about this.
OK, now I'll just take this moment to mention once again that we've got extended coverage of the return of Julian Assange to Australia. So about an hour and 15 minutes ago, he emerged from his plane at Canberra's Fairburn Air Force Defence Base and raised his fist and embraced his family to the cheers of people gathered at the fence. We heard the media was there. I don't know who else was there at that stage. We've heard from one of our reporters that, at this media conference that there's going to be in around half an hour at a hotel in Canberra, that there were people keen to go along to that. I'm not sure what happened with that. But yeah, I'll just mention that with that media conference, that's WikiLeaks has described that as a WikiLeaks media conference. So we're not quite sure exactly who is going to be talking at that media conference. We're not sure if it is going to include Julian Assange. And so, yeah, we've got that, momentous occasion there with Julian Assange touching down in Canberra after this 14-year saga. We've had a panel discussion about it with our longtime friend Sulet Dreyfus, our political lead David Spears, and Simon Jackman from the University of Sydney. We might just take this moment to go back a little earlier today to this curious little island in the Western Pacific, Saipan, which is 2,600 k's east of the Philippines, where Julian Assange decided to have this hearing where he would eventually be charged and plead guilty to this one espionage charge. And then the judge sentenced him to time already served, and he was able to return to Australia. His lawyers, Julian Assange's lawyers, spoke outside that hearing a little earlier today. We heard initially from his US lawyer and then his Australian lawyer. Let's take a listen to what they had to say.
The prosecution of Julian Assange is unprecedented. In the 100 years of the Espionage Act, it has never been used by the United States to pursue a publisher, a journalist like Mr. Assange. Mr. Assange revealed truthful, important, and newsworthy information, including revealing that the United States had committed war crimes, and he has suffered tremendously in his fight for free speech, for freedom of the press, and to ensure that the American public and the world community gets truthful and important newsworthy information. We firmly believe that Mr. Assange never should have been charged under the Espionage Act and engaged in exercise that journalists engage in every day, and we're thankful that they do. It is appropriate, though, for this fight to end, and it is appropriate for the judge, as she did today, to determine that no additional incarceration of Mr. Assange would be fair, would be appropriate, and it is time for him to be reunited with his family. Mr. Assange is grateful for all of the support that he has received and looks forward to reuniting with his wife and his children.
I think it's also important that we recognise the free speech implications of this case. Julian has suffered for more than 14 years because of the risk of extradition to the United States. He faced 175 years in prison for publishing evidence of war crimes, human rights abuse and US wrongdoing around the world. Today he pleaded guilty to an offence for having published information in the public interest, for which he's won journalism awards the world over and been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize every year for the past decade. This sets a dangerous precedent. This prosecution sets a dangerous precedent that should be of concern to journalists everywhere. The US is seeking to exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction over all of you without giving you constitutional free speech protections. And anyone who cares about free speech and democratic accountability should stand against it. But I want to encourage everyone that stood up and fought for Julian to continue to stand up and fight against this dangerous precedent. I hope that the fact that we've been able to free Julian Assange today against all the odds and against one of the most powerful governments in the world will give hope to all journalists and publishers who are imprisoned around the world. And we encourage everyone who stood to fight for Julian to continue that fight for him and for all of those others in the hope that we can secure their freedom too.
Australian lawyer Jennifer Robinson there, who's spent the most time of any lawyer at the side of Julian Assange working towards his freedom, which she succeeded with along with so many other people this afternoon. We've got Simon Jackman from the University of Sydney sitting with us. And Simon, so we heard earlier from Gabrielle Shipton, Julian Assange's brother, that they're definitely going to go for a pardon with the US president. What do you reckon the chances are of that actually happening?
Exceedingly low. Certainly close to zero between now and the presidential election. I think there's one window in which that might be possible, and that is if Joe Biden were to lose in November in the so-called lame duck period, where he is still serving president, but before presumably Donald Trump would be inaugurated in January. There may be a window there where Joe Biden's got room, and I can assure you that if this were to happen, Julian Assange would not be the only person being pardoned by Joe Biden. And that's typically when outgoing presidents, sometimes on their very last day in office, often issue a lot of clemency announcements or pardons like that. But I'd just say the political atmosphere in the United States right now is just so white hot, leading to what is a very close presidential election. It's inconceivable to me that Joe Biden would, of all the things to do right now, would be to pardon Assange. I think the lobbying from the Australian government, such as it was, been quite successful. I think both from the Biden administration's perspective and I think the Australian government's perspective, this matter is resolved for the time being. And it's really on, I think, family and friends now to pick up the mantle and pursue this. And that's a much you haven't got the resources of the Australian government, you don't have ambassadors and high commissioners making this case now. Now it's really a matter of friends and family, and I think they're bringing, frankly, less ammunition to the fight, and moreover, I think they're facing a much higher mountain to climb now, when I think the view in Washington that this is done and dusted.
Yeah, and through this evening you've been pointing to this Department of Justice statement that's come out in the wake of this, where the department remains very determined about Julian Assange's guilt and pointing to what it says is evidence of that. If you've got a US department that is still so strong on this, why would Joe Biden go against that?
And indeed, that's a great point, Joe, because one thing a president has to do, or typically does when considering a pardon, is to ask for an opinion from the Department of Justice. And in this case, I think the Department of Justice would look at the statement they've issued just today and say, we don't think this is an appropriate case. We've just had a guilty plea. That was carefully negotiated. Their statement makes a very clear case, by the way, as to why they think Assange was culpable. It's hard to imagine that same department then turns around weeks or even a couple of months later and says, oh, but we actually think a pardon is warranted in these cases. Now, President, ultimately the pardon power is the President's and the President's alone, but procedurally those things are run through the Pardon Office at the Department of Justice for a look-see, and you've got to imagine that in this case, no way.
And now just turning to what happened in the UK, because he was held in prison there, like a high security prison for 5 years. What did you make of how that was dealt with there politically and the timing of the UK election?
Well, you know, you heard the Prime Minister earlier tonight talking about how this has all come together at the end, and often that's what the end looks like. A lot of them, that's the definition of the end. I just keep thinking we've got a UK election coming up on July 4th. There is likely to be a change of government in the UK. Now, if I'm Stephen Smith, our High Commissioner in London, I'm thinking, get this done while I can talk to a current UK government with their Justice Department, their version of a Justice Department. Get this through the UK system as it is currently configured. The people, presumably, he's been negotiating with for months, because by the end of next week, there's going to be a different cast of characters and we may be starting all over again.
How can you be sure that's going to be happening?
Well, wearing my other hat as a pollster, I'm pretty confident about what's likely to happen in the UK. But I think that was a huge driver as well. Just getting this, perhaps a reason why this got done now, because we're at the very end of the life of the current British government by all accounts.
Yeah, and David Spears, what did you make of speaking of what's happening in the UK, the contributions of both Stephen Smith and Kevin Rudd here, and the fact that they were on the plane with him? I think, yeah.
Look, it's fascinating, right? I mean, they're two old hands politically, Labor war horses, if you will, one a former Prime Minister, one a former Foreign Minister, Defence Minister, put into those most important diplomatic posts by Anthony Albanese for good reason, and, you know, with plenty of previous practice of Prime Ministers putting in place trusted former politicians into those particular roles. The role that they played here, from all I understand, was quite huge. Look, for Kevin Rudd in the United States, that full-court diplomatic press, yes, the Prime Minister was raising this repeatedly with Joe Biden at the top, but then beyond that, and certainly with the Justice Department, Kevin Rudd had to do a lot of that work. For Stephen Smith in the UK, similar, but also with the Assange legal team as well, because don't forget, this also required them to agree, and Julian Assange himself to agree to this plea deal. So a lot of that fell to Stephen Smith. The fact they were both on the plane also shows, you know, they were wary of any hiccup here, wanting to make sure they were there to shepherd this through. And it's an extraordinary operation to get the most high-profile prisoner at Belmarsh Prison squirreled out of there onto a plane before news breaks of it even happening, then to the Northern Mariana Islands and back to Australia. This has been an incredible operation, so no doubt helps having the two top diplomats on board, literally, for the whole thing. But it comes back to this slight contradiction, if you like. The Prime Minister, you heard it again tonight, really respecting the independence of the judiciary, the Justice Department in the United States, really respecting the separation between the judiciary and the political process in the US democracy, but also wanting everyone to realise that it's the influence that he brought to bear and having those two top diplomats shepherd this through that really brought about this outcome. He said it was the culmination of this effort. So, yep, they're independent, but our pressure clearly played a part.
And what is Kevin Rudd's reputation as an ambassador? Because we often hear of his extraordinary passion and intellect, and we saw through his Prime Ministership an unfortunate example of how angry he can get at times.
Well,
but there are a lot of people who talk about how effective he is. What do you know about that?
A few things. As Prime Minister, he was famous for, well, a bunch of things, but one of them was micromanaging, overworking staff. There were fears. One of the fears of putting him into that role was that you would just burn out all of the embassy staff, annoy everyone in Washington. There were concerns that he would, step on the toes of the Foreign Minister. As a former Prime Minister and a China scholar as well, that he'd be in some way too big for his boots and making calls that didn't respect the chain of, the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. Look, a whole bunch of concerns, but from all accounts, and this isn't just people in the government telling me this, but people in the public service, people in diplomacy as well, they're pretty impressed with how he's gone as ambassador. And it's moments like this that you see that experience shine. So, look, not much criticism that I've picked up of how Kevin Rudd's going about this job. And also, look, Trump, you might recall not long ago, had a jab at him when he was asked by Nigel Farage in an interview. I've forgotten the exact words he said, not the brightest bulb or something like that about Kevin Rudd. But in the scheme of Trump insults, pretty mild. And from all accounts, he has been working pretty hard, even with Scott Morrison, former political foe, but someone who does have the ear of Donald Trump to a degree, to build the bridges, but also in the US Congress as well, with Republicans that are close to Trump, doing a lot of that difficult work in preparing quietly for the prospect, at least, of a Trump return. So not an easy position.
OK, we might leave it there for the moment. David Spears in Canberra and Simon Jackman here in the studio. Thanks so much. And, special mentions to our earlier guests as well. Soulette Dreyfus, who is a long-time friend of Julian Assange and has actually written a book with him. We spoke to Soulette at length. And quite memorably, we were also speaking to Gabrielle Shipton, Julian Assange's brother, and we might be able to bring up some shots now of Julian Assange leaving the plane once again as we finish off. We're speaking to Gabrielle as the plane touched down, and then as his brother got off the plane after this extraordinary 14-year saga. Thanks for joining us on the ABC News channel for coverage of the return of Julian Assange to Australia.
Tonight, on a special edition of The World, after 14 years of house arrest, embassy asylum and prison, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is tonight back home in Australia, a free man. Now, here's the moment from just a short time ago, just before 8 p.m. Eastern Time, when he stepped out of that plane. Right onto Australian soil, to the sound of cheering, with his fist raised, and then walking from the tarmac to embrace his wife, Stella, and a bit later on his father as well. We will take you live to a WikiLeaks press conference in about 15 minutes' time. That's being held at the hotel where Mr. Assange's family is staying tonight, and we'll bring you the very latest then. Well, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese spoke to the media after Julian Assange's plane landed. He said he had spoken to Mr. Assange and that the WikiLeaks founder's case had dragged on for too long.
Regardless of what you think of his activities, Mr. Assange's case had dragged on for far too long. I have clearly and consistently, at every opportunity and at every level, advocated for Mr. Assange's case to be concluded. I am very pleased that this saga is over. And earlier tonight, I was pleased to speak with Mr. Assange, to welcome him home, and had the opportunity to ask about his health and to have my first discussion with him. His safe return to Australia, we know, means so much to his family. His wife Stella, his children, who he is looking forward to playing with, like any dad, and his parents Christine and John. There are a range of views about the actions of Mr. Assange. The Australian government feels strongly that the proper protection of all national security information is vital for safety. But as I have said, both as Labor leader and as Prime Minister, there was nothing to be gained by the further incarceration of Mr. Assange, and we wanted him brought home. Tonight, that has happened. We have got this done.
Anthony Albanese there speaking just as Julian Assange, WikiLeaks founder, touched down safely back in Australia. We are awaiting a WikiLeaks press conference that we're expecting in just under 15 minutes or so. We'll bring you that live and have all the latest for you. Well, Julian Assange's brother, Gabrielle Shipton, was speaking with the ABC's Joe O'Brien and was watching live as Mr. Assange emerged from that plane this evening. Here's a bit of how he reacted.
The first image.
There he is.
Raising his fist.
Yes. Oh, he's home.
There he is. Yeah, welcome home, Julian. Welcome home. There he is. Oh, wow.
And so, Gabriel, what does that raised fist indicate to you about what he's going to be getting up to over the next couple of years?
Well, I think I remember being in the court, 4 years ago in the magistrate's court and watching from the gallery, and Julian was behind these glass panels, and he raised his fist to me when I was watching from the gallery. So, it's a message a message that we've shared throughout this campaign, and I think it's a signal to everybody who's been fighting this that he's going to keep fighting. So, oh wow, what a moment! Look at that.
That's fantastic.
So Julian Assange there embracing his wife and father after this extraordinary saga which has dragged on for so long. Sylette Dreyfus, his longtime friend, is with us and who's campaigned tirelessly for him over many, many years. How are you feeling now?
That was a reaction from Gabriel Shipton, Julian Assange's brother, as Julian Assange touched down on Australian soil just over an hour ago. Just to update you, we are waiting on a WikiLeaks press conference to be held at a Canberra hotel in the next 10 minutes or so. We're not too sure who's speaking at that press conference yet, but we will bring you the details as soon as we have it, and we will cross live to it. It comes just over an hour after Julian Assange arrived back in Australia. I'm joined now by international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Hart. Now, Peter, how momentous is Julian Assange's arrival back home in Australia? It's been a 14-year battle for him and his freedom. His family and supporters have been waiting for this moment for more than a decade now.
On the personal level, it's obviously a pretty profound relief for Julian Assange, and his family obviously is hugely pleased and relieved. He's received a bit of a folk hero's welcome. Interesting to see that so many TV networks ran live tracking maps of his plane as it approached Canberra, and then showed cut live to him emerging from the plane. There's been a sort of a frenzy. It's a bit like, the Queen's visit to Australia and first visit in 1954, or Taylor Swift turning up or something like that, where although he returns to Australia a convicted felon as a result of pleading guilty in a court today, a US court in Saipan, to a charge of espionage, he's obviously managing to transcend that in the media and presumably some of the public's opinion. A bit of the Ned Kelly effect, I imagine, where you might be a crook, but you're still a bit of a hero for having defied the authorities, which Julian Assange has become a symbol of defiance.
What do you think must be going through his mind right now? I know we're not mind readers, but it must be such a surreal moment for him. And also his wife described sensory overload as well. Yes, he appeared both on landing in Canberra tonight, but also in Saipan earlier, to be not only in good spirits, but also in good health, in stark contrast to recent years when he's been in the UK and hasn't been well enough, apparently, to appear in a court. And yet now he's not only looking healthy and strong up and down stairs, but almost jaunty. So his health appears to be good. His frame of mind appears to be positive. We know from his lawyers and family that there have been times in recent years when he thought he might never manage to escape extradition to the US, might never manage to avoid decades in a US prison. So he's told, apparently, according to Anthony Albanese, he's told the Prime Minister it was a surreal moment. And
I can imagine after the years of persecution, prosecution, worry and fear, that it must seem surreal to be able to walk a free man, to hug his wife, to speak on the phone to the Prime Minister and be welcomed home.
Indeed, and just getting on that plane as well. Let's rewind back to the events of today. Just 12 hours ago, he was on US soil in a Saipan court delivering his plea deal. What stood out to you about this hearing?
Two things stood out to me, Yvonne. One was the fact that he, as a consequence of having to agree to the deal, had to plead guilty. He had to say he had committed the crime of espionage, of a conspiracy to unlawfully obtain classified national security documents. So he had to make that admission. And the judge in the court took him through that twice to make sure he was actually admitting culpability, which he did. The second point that struck me was that despite that, and in contravention perhaps of that or exculpation of that, he maintained again that he was doing the work of a journalist. He used those words, "In working as a journalist, I did these things." Now, that is a hotly contested claim. It is the claim which he has used and his supporters and lawyers have used from the beginning to give his work legitimacy. It's a definition that many journalists fundamentally object to, but they were the two points that struck me today.
Well, just to update viewers, we are expecting to hear an upcoming press conference from WikiLeaks. We don't know yet who's going to be speaking. Peter, what do you think we can expect to hear?
I suppose we can expect to hear relief, triumphalism perhaps, which would be entirely justified. Perhaps defiance. I think we heard that in some of Julian Assange's remarks in the court in Saipan. We saw it in his clenched fist above his head as he emerged from the plane in Canberra. However, tempering any thoughts of future defiance, he's also said, according to Anthony Albanese, in his phone call to the Prime Minister after touching down tonight, he said to Albanese, "You saved my life." Now, there could well be a tension here between gratitude to Albanese and the Australian government and the entire diplomatic system, which has devoted enormous resources to his case and bringing him back to Australia in the last couple of years. The tension between gratitude and appreciation for that on the one hand, and on the other, what sort of agitation will he continue to do in his job as I wouldn't describe him as a journalist, I would describe him as an activist. In his work as an activist, to disclose documents, to publish secrets, will he put his home country, his host country, and his saviour country in embarrassing, difficult, awkward positions in future disclosures? We know that he was prepared in 2016. He published documents that, according to the US, were stolen from John Podesta, in Hillary Clinton's Democrat campaign, stole documents. The Russians stole documents, supplied them to WikiLeaks, and were published by Julian Assange. And those documents then, according to Hillary Clinton, impaired her campaign for the presidency and assisted Donald Trump. That sort of disclosure and activity, will he continue to do that? Will he resume doing that now that he's back in Australia? And will that put him in tension with the Australian government? These are questions that we'll soon find out the answers to, I suspect.
Yes, we are all waiting to hear from him, but I understand he won't necessarily be speaking at this upcoming press conference, which is due in just a few minutes' time. We're expecting to hear from WikiLeaks. We don't know just yet, and this is just over an hour after he touched down on Australian soil. Peter, can you tell us, how did the Albanese government get this done, as he has said, where previous governments have tried but not been able to?
I'd nominate a couple of things, Yvonne. One is direct and persistent efforts by the Prime Minister himself. There's no substitute for a head of government talking directly to another head of government, asking for a favour, asking for help, and there's a constant exchange of favours between governments. So Albanese told us tonight that he'd first raised it with Joe Biden, US President, at a NATO summit in Europe a couple of years ago. Now, that wasn't disclosed, I don't think, at the time, but for future reference, the people who enjoy jumping on a Prime Minister whenever he leaves the country to an international summit might just keep in the back of their minds that all sorts of deals and transactions and work is done at those meetings. It's not all beer and Skittles, champagne and cocktails. So Albanese tells us that he raised it subsequently in every contact he's had with Joe Biden. That's an irreducible aspect of getting this return and this deal done. The other, I'd suggest, is the widening campaign that has embraced all political parties in the Australian Parliament. Just a few years ago, there were a couple of lone voices. Well, if there are a couple, they can't be lone. With a mere couple of voices in the Australian Parliament raised in his cause. But by last year, we had a dozen or more cross-party delegation embracing everything from the National Party, the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, the Greens, independents. So, and that represented, I think, a groundswell in politics and in the broader public. So those two things, I think, came together, and Albanese's will then was expressed through the diplomatic network. Kevin Rudd, obviously, in Washington, has been working this fairly hard, and Stephen Smith in London. Again, this is and the supporting staffs in all those cities, in Canberra as well. That's a big deployment of diplomatic effort and public and national resources in this case, in pursuit of the return of Julian Assange.
Indeed, it has been in the works for a long time now. It hasn't just happened over the past 24 hours, even though we have been covering it intently over the past day. We're expecting a press conference from WikiLeaks any moment now. Peter, if you could just hang on and we'll speak to you after that when we get it.
Sure.
Well, we're waiting to bring you that press conference, but meanwhile, let's turn to author Sulette Dreyfus, is a long-time friend and supporter of Julian Assange, and she says the WikiLeaks founder's always been passionate about seeking the truth and remains hopeful of a full pardon.
Julian is a person who has always carried the need for justice on his shoulder, and some people it's okay for them to walk past injustice and it doesn't really bother them. Julian's not been that person, so he finds it hard, I think, to walk past injustice when he sees it. It's really interesting, actually. This is a moment of great humanity, and Anthony Albanese has done really quite a wonderful job here. But the thing that I found most reassuring is the fact that the Prime Minister is not an abandoner. Anthony Albanese is a doer. He might have said he did it quietly, but he's a doer and he's going to look after Australians. Well, that's a little bit like Julian. He's a doer. He doesn't want to just let things go through the net and it doesn't matter. And I think that really matters. Maybe they do things a bit differently, but perhaps they recognize that in each other as well.
Well, let's hear more from Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who spoke just as Julian Assange landed in Australia. The Prime Minister says it took some time to negotiate a plea deal for Julian Assange. Mr Albanese first raised the issue with US President Joe Biden at a 2022 NATO summit and also discussed the issue with other US officials.
But this was always the case, to be very clear, that because of the separation between the political representatives and the judiciary, this was always going to be something that required discussion, patient with the Department of Justice. And certainly over that period of time, there has been an issue as well. I've exchanged very directly with Mr Assange's lawyers, as have our diplomatic representatives. And Mr Assange's lawyers have been very determined to achieve an outcome. And of course, the nature of his incarceration in Belmarsh has meant that then communication had to then be got through. Stephen Smith, our High Commissioner, has visited him on a number of occasions. The details of the plea deal were worked through over a period of time. But what we have been focused on very clearly, and for some of the issues that have raised with me, it was the case that this was the only way that I could see a resolution being achieved.
Well, let's bring in the ABC's political lead, David Spears, who is in Canberra as we await that press conference. Now, David, we're looking to hear from WikiLeaks and eventually one day Julian Assange himself, but that might not happen for quite a while. Understandably, he might want to take this time to process all of this.
You would expect so. I'd be surprised if we do see him appear in the next few minutes. They're keeping an element of surprise as to who is going to appear, and that's keeping us all, keeping the attention of us all. But look, I'd be surprised. You're right. I think some time to process this. I mean, it's impossible for us to really, I think, appreciate how he must be feeling. The Prime Minister, in the remarks he made a little earlier this evening, speaking of his phone conversation with Julian Assange before he disembarked from the plane, said he was happy, but it was surreal. And yeah, that's a description you can certainly understand after the ordeal he's been through, particularly those 5 years in Belmarsh, then this whirlwind, 24, 36 hours to get from there to here, and now a free man. What must be going through his head, we don't know. But look, whoever speaks here, whether we get some indication of what Julian Assange's movements will be over the coming days, but longer term, as Peter was touching on just a little earlier, what role he will play in the ongoing fight for press freedom, whether he's going to apply pressure on the Australian government over issues of press freedom and whistleblower protection, whether he is going to press for a pardon from President Biden as well. Maybe we get some further indications on that front. But look, I suspect really this is about the celebration of the moment for the supporters of Assange. And we've heard from his family tonight, his friends, those are close to him. You know, this is clearly a great moment of celebration. It's clearly a moment of celebration for the Prime Minister as well. And while, you know, he's not going overboard, he wasn't there on the tarmac, there was no red carpet laid out. Again, as Peter Harcher pointed out, the spectacle of this moment can't be missed. And the political capital that's there for Anthony Albanese, he doesn't want to miss either. I think he's correctly judged early on that Australians, yes, might have mixed views on Julian Assange, but figured after so long, the way this had dragged on, the amount of time he spent locked up, enough was enough, that it was time to bring him home. And I think the Prime Minister knows that that's the sentiment in Australia. It's certainly the sentiment in the Australian Parliament, even amongst those critical of what he and WikiLeaks did, that it's time to bring him home. So, yeah, he wants it known that this is the culmination of his work, the work of his top diplomats, Kevin Rudd and Stephen Smith, while also arguing and continuing to note that the US Justice Department and its system of justice is independent from political and diplomatic pressure. So it's a slightly contradictory argument. They're independent, but our pressure worked. Nonetheless, from the Australian perspective, this is a win, this is an outcome the Prime Minister certainly welcomes. That's it for him, though. I think job done. This is the outcome he wanted. I don't think the Prime Minister is going to take up, and certainly hasn't, through the course of this whole saga, those arguments around press freedom. It would be somewhat hypocritical for him to do so, given, you know, in many ways we have more draconian laws here in Australia. We don't have a First Amendment protection for free speech.
David, we're going to interrupt you there. We'll go to the presser right now and hear what WikiLeaks has to say.
To Australia, it started 2 days ago. Julian was released from bail in the UK early on Monday morning UK time. We had to spend 12 hours in Stansted Airport before we boarded a flight to Bangkok. Another 8 or 9 hours in Bangkok before we flew to
Lauren, what's her name again?
Julian entered his plea. We are absolutely delighted, after a very long and complex negotiation with the US government, that we've reached this plea deal that enabled him to come home to Australia as a free man. The agreement is that he will spend no more time in prison. The terms of the plea deal are, unfortunately, that he, in order to achieve his freedom and to leave the high security prison in Belmarsh, he had to choose to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage for publishing evidence of US war crimes, human rights abuse. Guys, it's really hard to do this when there's so much noise going on in the background. Thank you very much. In order to win his freedom, Julian pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage for publishing evidence of US war crimes, human rights abuse and US wrongdoing around the world. This is journalism. This is the criminalisation of journalism. And while the plea deal does not set a judicial precedent, it's not a court decision, the prosecution itself sets a precedent that can be used against the rest of the media. It's important that journalists all around the world understand the dangerous precedent that this prosecution has set. An award-winning Australian journalist who's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for these publications has spent more than 5 years in a high-security prison because of this extradition request from the United States. We are absolutely thrilled that Julian is now home in Australia. I can say when we landed here in Australia, I became very emotional the moment we landed. And the Prime Minister was the first person to get on the phone to speak to Julian. Julian thanked him and the team and told the Prime Minister that he had saved his life. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Prime Minister Albanese, for his principled leadership, the statesmanship and diplomacy that he showed in leading the effort to bring Julian home to Australia. It was as opposition leader that he said enough is enough, that there was nothing to be served by Julian's ongoing incarceration. As Prime Minister, he kept his word. He raised it at the highest level at every single opportunity. He has continued to ask the US to bring this to an end, and his efforts completely changed the situation for Julian and enabled our negotiations with the US government that allowed us to reach this outcome. I also want to thank our ambassador to the US, Kevin Rudd, our former Prime Minister, whose relentless efforts in Washington, working together closely with us, with myself and my co-counsel Barry Pollock, completely changed our relationship with the US and completely changed the negotiations. Without his efforts and his adept diplomacy, we would not be in the position we are today and Julian would not be home. I also want to thank Stephen Smith, our High Commissioner in London, who worked tirelessly, and the team at DFAT, the consular staff who really facilitated our trip home and were incredibly kind to Julian along the way. This is a huge win for Australia and for Australian democracy. This is a huge win for free speech. This is a huge win for Australia that our Prime Minister stood up to our ally, the United States, and demanded the return of an Australian citizen. And that Julian came home today is the product of 14 long years of legal battles, political advocacy, and ongoing campaigning, not just by us, but by so many people in this community. A global movement was created around Julian and the need to protect free speech, and it's that global movement that has led to his release today. I really want to thank everyone who has joined us in this fight, who have supported us along the way, because without that support and the campaigning that's been done, we just wouldn't be in this position. Julian is incredibly grateful for the support that he's had from the Australian government and from the public here in Australia, and we're delighted that he's home. He's finally home. I'm going to invite I'm happy, we might take questions, I might just at the end if that's okay, but I'd like to invite my US co-counsel Barry Pollock to come and address you about the plea deal.
Good evening. Earlier today in a courthouse in Saipan, we had a hearing that brought to a close a prosecution that never should have been brought. Julian Assange has, for so many years, sacrificed for freedom of speech and freedom of the press. He's sacrificed his own freedom. And finally, today, that tragic situation ended, and we are all grateful that Julian is back home in Australia where he belongs, back with Stella, back with his children, reunited with his father. It is unprecedented in the United States to use the Espionage Act to criminally prosecute a journalist or a publisher. It's in the more than 100-year history of that law, it has never been used in this fashion. It is certainly our hope that it will never again be used in this fashion. Julian spent years in Belmarsh. No one should spend a day in prison for giving the public newsworthy and important information. In this case, information that the United States government had committed war crimes, that there were civilian casualties exponentially greater than the United States government had admitted in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was definitely in the public's interest to have this information, and Julian provided it to the public. He performed a tremendous public service, not a crime. The problem with the Espionage Act is there is no First Amendment defense in the Espionage Act. It does, by its terms, not matter the reason why you publish. The U.S. for years, the U.S. government has claimed that these publications did great harm. Today in court, the United States government admitted that there is not a single person anywhere that they can produce that was actually harmed by these publications. Hopefully this is the end, not just of the case against Julian Assange, but the end of the case against journalism. Thank you.
I wish to thank the Prime Minister, Albanese, the officials who have been working in DFAT on securing Julian's release. I'd also like to thank the Australian people who have made this possible, because without their support, there would not be the political space to be able to achieve Julian's freedom. And that support is across the board. I thank the opposition for also supporting Julian's release. It took all of them. It took millions of people. It took people working behind the scenes, people protesting on the streets for days and weeks and months and years. And we achieved it. Julian wanted me to sincerely thank everyone. He wanted to be here. But you have to understand what he's been through. He needs time. He needs to recuperate. And this is a process. I ask you, please, to give us space, to give us privacy, to find our place, to let our family be a family before he can speak again at a time of his choosing. I think it's important to recognize that Julian's release and the breakthrough in the negotiations came at a time when there had been a breakthrough in the legal case in the UK, in the extradition, where the High Court had allowed permission to appeal. There was a court date set for the 9th and 10th of July, an upcoming court date in which Julian would be able to raise the First Amendment argument at the High Court. And it is in this context that things finally started to move. I think it revealed how uncomfortable the United States government is in fact of having these arguments aired, because the fact is that this case is an attack on journalism, it's an attack on the public's right to know, and it should never have been brought. Julian should never have spent a single day in prison. But today we celebrate, because today Julian is free.
We'll take 10 minutes of questions, just address them to the individual, and I'll tell you when we're out last 3 or so.
I think the first question, Ms. Robinson, is the return of Julian Assange has revived this huge debate about whether his activities were right or wrong. And we've seen political figures in the US and in Australia here say that he's no hero, that his disclosures put lives at risk. Some Democrats don't like the disclosures about Hillary Clinton, for instance. What's your response to this sort of fundamental argument that's been made against Julian Assange, that he put lives at risk, for instance, and that his disclosures were not in the public interest?
Well, to start with, there's no evidence of any actual harm, and that's exactly what the US government acknowledged in court today in Saipan. So there is no evidence that anyone was physically harmed as a result of those publications. The public interest in those publications is clear. Evidence of war crimes, that the US had not disclosed the extent of civilian casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan, the use of torture and other forms of human rights abuse around the world. There is no denying the public interest in WikiLeaks publications, which is reflected in the reasons why WikiLeaks has won the Walkley Award for Most Outstanding Contribution to Journalism, the Sydney Peace Prize, the fact that Julian's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize every year since those publications. So to suggest that this was not in the public interest, I don't understand the basis upon which they could possibly suggest that. And so I think this is clear.
Stella, can we have a question through the mic? That moment on the tarmac where you embraced Julian must have been incredibly surreal. Was that the moment you realised that this was over, that it was home?
Yes, I was overcome by emotion when I first heard that there were crowds cheering that I didn't even know were there behind a fence because it was dark. And then I heard them cheer more and more and flashes, and then I turned the corner and then I saw that Julian was coming, and we embraced, and I mean, I think you've seen the pictures. I don't want to express in words what is obvious from the image.
Stella, what comes next for Julian Assange with this revitalised WikiLeaks career and politically what happens, what's next?
Julian needs time to recover, to get used to freedom. Someone told me yesterday who had been through something similar that freedom comes slowly, and I want Julian to have that space to rediscover freedom slowly and quickly.
Jen, as one of my colleagues mentioned the Podesta files earlier, I think he may not have read them. Could you, now you have the opportunity, just remind us of how to actually reform the DNC and the corruption within? The Podesta files were really good for the Democratic National Congress, yes?
Look, there's clearly public interest in the DNC materials that was released by WikiLeaks, and in terms of the legality of those publications, there's a US court decision showing that it had the highest possible protection of the First Amendment. So from a principal point of view, people might not like the politics of any particular publication, but that publication is absolutely protected by the First Amendment, as US courts have found.
Jen, are there any post-release conditions for Julian, parole periods, The US have said that he's banned from returning, stepping foot in the US, gag orders, anything like that. And can you and Barry give us a sense of the negotiations with the DOJ, particularly given Julian's strong-held view that he was not guilty of the crime?
I think it's best Barry speaks to the terms of the plea deal.
There are absolutely no restrictions on Julian. The case against him is over. There is no gag order. There are no other restrictions. He is going to be able to go back to whatever life he chooses to build with Stella and his family. The negotiations were a protracted process that went on for several months, sort of in fits and starts. We were not close to any sort of a resolution until a few weeks ago, when the Department of Justice re-engaged, and there have been very intense negotiations over the last few weeks. One thing we were very clear about was that any resolution would have to end this matter, and that Julian would be free, that he was not going to do additional time in prison, he was not going to do time under supervision, he was not going to do time under a gag order. So that was one absolute requirement. Another significant point of negotiation was where the plea would be taken. Julian did not want to come to the United States in any form. Ultimately, obviously, we negotiated Saipan under conditions where he would be released in the UK. He would come to Saipan not as a prisoner of the United States or the United Kingdom, and that we would come in and leave on the same day, which is exactly what happened. And other provisions of the plea that were very significant. The United States agreed that they are not going to bring any other charges against Julian for any conduct, any publications, any news gathering, anything at all that occurred prior to the time of the plea. So even if he had prevailed in the extradition proceeding, that would have just resolved this case. This resolves any possible case that the United States could bring against Julian for any subject matter. So that was obviously very significant to us.
Thank you. Jen and also Stella, you called yesterday your hopes for a pardon to be granted to Julian. How do you see that playing out? Would you like the Australian government to support that call? What could be possibly done to actually achieve that outcome in your view?
Look, I think today we celebrate Julian's freedom. Today is the day that the plea deal was approved by the judge. I think it's also a day where I hope journalists and editors and publishers everywhere realize the danger of the of this U.S. case against Julian that criminalizes, that has secured a conviction for news gathering and publishing information that was in the public interest, that was true, that the public deserved to know. And that precedent now can and will be used in the future against the rest of the press. So it is in the interest of all of the press to seek for this current state of affairs to change through reform of the Espionage Act, through increased press protections, and yes, eventually, when the time comes, not today, a pardon.
Stella, can I ask how hopeful and how confident are you
that your husband will be pardoned. And what do you think has been at the absolute core of the shift in Sam's head that's enabled his release?
I think freedom of the press is in a very dangerous place. It's not evident that it will move towards more protections, but rather less. There needs to be a conscious and joint effort to push back, and that pushback should have resulted in the dropping of the case against Julian. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. That would have been the only good outcome for the press in general if the US government had abandoned this case entirely. Now you have the press in a as vulnerable position as Julian has been. And that came the day the indictment came down. Let's be clear about that. That didn't come down with this conviction. And frankly, that mobilization should have happened years ago. And that's what enabled the conviction.
So, will be pardoned? Is Mr. Assange?
I think he'll be pardoned if the press unite to push back against this precedent. Because it affects all of you. It affects your future ability to inform the public and to publish without fear.
Is Mr. Assange going to meet the Prime Minister in the coming days?
No comment.
Can we have 3 more questions?
Here, Stella, here. Well, what I can say from the phone call with the Prime Minister this afternoon when we landed is that he is delighted that Stella and Julian are both now in Australia, and we certainly hope that at some point they'll be able to meet.
Does Julian plan to keep going with WikiLeaks and publish more documents, more journalism?
Look, he just arrived in Australia after being in a high-security prison for over 5 years and a, how long, 72-hour flight or something like that. It's premature. Julian has to recover. That's the priority. And the fact is that Julian will always defend human rights, will always defend victims. He's always done that. And that's just part of who he is. He is deeply principled. And he remains deeply principled and unafraid.
Stella, here in Spanish, please.
Thank you very much, everybody.
That brings to an end a press conference by Julian Assange's team, his lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, her US co-counsel, Barry Pollock, and also Julian Assange's wife, Stella Assange. Jennifer Robinson recapped what had happened and confirmed that Julian Assange will spend no more time in prison. In order to achieve his freedom, he had to choose to plead guilty to the charge under the US Espionage Act. Despite him having to do that, she said it's a huge win for Australia, democracy and free speech. She said it's important journalists recognise the dangerous precedent also that this prosecution has set. And Jennifer Robinson said in the call with the Prime Minister, Julian Assange had thanked him for his leadership, leading the effort to bring him home. Now, Jennifer Robinson's US co-counsel Barry Pollock also spoke, saying it is unprecedented to use Espionage Act against a journalist in this fashion. Stella Assange also thanked the Australian people as well. Well, let's bring in the ABC's political lead, David Spears, in Canberra. Now, David, again, Julian Assange's team thanking Prime Minister Anthony Albanese for his leadership. A lot of gratitude expressed there.
Yeah, sure. And I think the memorable line there that Julian Assange said to Anthony Albanese as he sat on the tarmac before he disembarked the plane, he said to the Prime Minister, "You saved my life." Now, that's going to be a memorable line, no doubt. Someone like Anthony Albanese will carry that with him for some time. But it fits absolutely with what we heard from the Prime Minister earlier. He wants the credit for what he and his government did to achieve this outcome, while noting the independence of the justice system. Certainly make no mistake that the pressure brought to bear by Australia is seen by the Assange team and by the Australian government as being pivotal here. I think what we heard there from the Assange team also was clearly the view that this is a movement that's brought this about, and they don't want that movement to now die away. They want that movement, and particularly a united effort by the press in support of Julian Assange to keep pushing for that pardon and to keep pushing for greater protections for press freedom, that the US Espionage Act, in what they see is a disappointing and dangerous precedent here, has been used to secure a conviction, including a jail term, time served, but a conviction with a jail term for what they believe was an act of journalism. Now, while that's disputed, that push for greater protections, First Amendment protections for press freedom, will continue. As I mentioned earlier, not something the Australian government is going to weigh in on. Individual MPs like Andrew Wilkie, Barnaby Joyce, other supporters of Julian Assange will continue making that case, but it's not a case the Australian Prime Minister has ever bought into. This, for him, has simply been about getting the job done, the job being the return of Julian Assange to Australia. Now he's back on home soil.
And David, we also got a bit more information about the negotiation process and how the hearing came to be heard in Saipan.
Yeah, and this is where some of those diplomatic efforts from Stephen Smith, the High Commissioner, Kevin Rudd, the Ambassador to the United States, played a part. We heard a couple of conditions there. We heard a bit about the lengthy delays they had at Stansted Airport, getting out of London, in Thailand as well, where they refuelled. But we heard a couple of conditions there. No gag order, so he is free to speak. Unclear when that might happen, but he is free to speak. But also this process of doing it through the Northern Mariana Islands there in Saipan, a federal court outpost, if you will, where a US judge could rubber stamp this plea deal on soil that was as close as possible to Australia, to avoid him having to go to the mainland, set foot there, and make as quick a return to Australia as possible here.
David Spears, thanks so much for talking to us tonight. So much happening. Appreciate it. Let's get more on this with international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Harcher. Now, Peter, freedom of the press is in a very dangerous place. That's what Stella Assange said, and she said he should never have faced these charges in the first place.
That was the theme that recurred right throughout that press conference, Yvonne. We heard it from both of Assange's lawyers, from Jennifer Robinson and Barry Pollock. We heard it from his wife Stella. It was the original, the continuing and the current claim for legitimation of what he did, elevating what Julian Assange did rather than just being some mischief into being a cause, giving it purpose, consistently describing it as journalism and publishing. And in that cause, they claim Assange is a martyr and call for the press, the media in Australia and elsewhere now to unite to get him a pardon, to remove what they've described, what Jennifer Robinson described as a dangerous precedent for all journalists. However, this jars a bit with the facts here, and I hate to be the witch at the christening here, Yvonne, but I'd point to a couple of things. Was Assange a publisher? Well, if he put information on the internet makes him a publisher, then we're all publishers now. The second point is about journalism and his consistent claim, and as he claimed in the court in Saipan today, that he was working as a journalist. Ethical journalists do due diligence on sensitive documents before publication that WikiLeaks did not do. And in fact, multiple US media and reporters reported the same documents, many of the documents that WikiLeaks published. Has the US attempted to prosecute any of them? No, is the answer. And the difference is this. Assange simply put them all on the web. Ethical professional journalists exercise due diligence to protect sources so that religious leaders, political dissidents, other sources of US intelligence weren't put at risk. Now, the US has admitted they can't find any of their sources who were killed or harmed as a result of those disclosures. That seems to be the fact, and that's a good thing. However, it doesn't seem that Julian Assange undertook that due diligence in the first place. Other journalists, real journalists, weren't prosecuted because they did the due diligence, protected sources and protected national security. The second point I'd make is it hasn't had a chilling effect, obviously, on investigative journalism in Australia, not at all. War crimes have been disclosed and investigated and are now being prosecuted in the Australian system because of investigative reporting by the ABC's Chris Masters and the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age's Nick McKenzie, Ben Roberts-Smith, and a range of other Australian Special Forces soldiers have been investigated, and we know there's a whole saga there. Are those Australian journalists intimidated? Have they been prosecuted? The answer is no. Professional journalists acting ethically can, and will continue to publish. This is an important distinction that I think many journalists are keen to make. Although as I say, I don't want to be the witch at the christening, but I think it's an important point for professional journalists to note.
Peter, thank you so much for your time tonight. Really appreciate it, and to get all your views. Thank you.
Pleasure, Yvonne.
Well, let's get more on this. Let's move on to recap our top stories now for you. Our one and only story, actually. Julian Assange is tonight a free man touching down in Australia this evening. He landed to cheering supporters after having his long-running legal case finalised in a US court. The WikiLeaks founder pleaded guilty to a single espionage charge in a deal that's allowed him to return home. The WikiLeaks team held a press conference, his legal advisor telling media that after a long and complex negotiation, the deal means he will spend no more time in prison. And his wife Stella thanked supporters, the Prime Minister and officials involved in achieving his freedom. And she did also say they will be looking to hopefully get a pardon for Julian Assange, but that will be quite some time for now. For now, his family have asked for privacy as Julian Assange readjusts to living here home in Australia after a 14-year legal saga to fight extradition to the US. Well, that is your world for tonight. You can always watch the show on iView. We have Manny Segas coming up with all the latest. I'm Yvonne Yong.